Klockan är 9 och kammaren.
It's 9 o'clock and we're in session. And we're here for the foreign policy debate. Before we begin with the debate, I want to welcome the representatives of the diplomatic corps. And you're welcome to listen to the debate. And oops, I forgot that we're starting with the debate, says the speaker. The foreign policy debate and the rules for the debate. The debate is divided into two parts. First, an opening part with the Minister for Foreign Affairs and representatives from the different parties. And then a second part. The Minister for Foreign Affairs will open by presenting the government statement on foreign policy. This address may take a maximum of 20 minutes, and then we'll have addresses from the other parties in the order of size. And these can take more than 8 minutes. We have free right of rejoinder for all these speeches with the order of size in the Riksdag. And the dueling method will apply with 2 minutes and then 1 minute. And the speeches are made from the rostrum and on the platform, and the rejoinders are made from the rostrums in the front of the platform. And we will begin with the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mrs. Maria Malmer Stenegard. Please go ahead. Mr. Speaker, Sweden is facing a challenging security era. We in Sweden, the EU and NATO, were in the midst of a long-term confrontation with Russia. Our task is inescapable. We will constrain Russia's capability to do us harm, particularly through our support to Ukraine. We will be guided by our national security interests, our democratic values, international law, and our belief in a free and strong Ukraine. And we will forge even closer ties with our allies and partners in the Nordic-Baltic region, in the EU, in NATO and globally. The international solidarity that followed last week's horrific mass shooting in Örebro shows that Sweden never stands alone. Mr. Speaker, the support to Ukraine is the government's top foreign policy priority. Sweden has increased its support to Ukraine for each year of the war. Our support since the start of the full-scale invasion totals around Swedish krona 70 billion. Whether Europe will consist of foreign sovereign states in the future is being determined on the battlefields of Ukraine. Russia's goal is to impose a sphere of influence with vassals and satellites, including in the Baltic Sea region. For Sweden, support to Ukraine is a moral obligation and an indispensable investment in Europe's and, by extension, our own security, independence and future. It is up to Ukraine if and when negotiations are to be initiated. Our unequivocal focus is to make Ukraine's position stronger. Pressure on Russia's war economy must increase. Europe's defense capability and our military support to Ukraine must be strengthened. And for this reason, the government recently presented its 18th military support package, the largest to date. The only sustainable peace is one that Ukraine achieves through strength. Peace negotiated from a position of weakness would only encourage further Russian aggression. Sweden will continue to provide political, humanitarian, military and financial support to Ukraine for as long as it takes. Mr. Speaker, together with our allies and partners, we will constrain Russia from a position of strength. The political and military credibility of NATO's Article 5 is the foundation of our policy of constraining Russia. And our geography and capabilities allow us, as an ally, to strengthen deterrence across Northern Europe. We will fully accept the responsibility this entails. This benefits Sweden, our neighbours, and the entire alliance. Swedish soldiers are now part of NATO's forward land forces in Latvia. Sweden is contributing through its presence in and monitoring of the Euro-Atlantic area in the air and at sea. We're shouldering our regional responsibilities as framework nation in NATO's forward land forces in Finland. Within the framework of the EU and NATO, we're strengthening our resilience against hybrid attacks, antagonistic actions aimed at destabilizing our societies, such as cyber attacks, disinformation, and the sabotage of critical infrastructure. NATO's enhanced activities following the recent damage to underwater cables in the Baltic Sea region are a testament to the alliance's cohesion, speed and strength. Sweden is making a powerful contribution to NATO's Operation Baltic Sentry, providing up to 3 warships and the radar surveillance aircraft. Sweden is a driving force in the EU efforts to develop a strategic strategy to address Russia's hybrid activities. We're also working to ensure that NATO strengthens its deterrence of hybrid attacks. The national security strategy makes it clear that Sweden's internal and external security are interlinked. The government will continue to work internationally in the fight against cross-border organised crime. It is also necessary to intensify our bilateral cooperation efforts so that criminals orchestrating crime in Sweden from abroad, they can be extradited and prosecuted. More also needs to be done in partnership with third countries to reduce irregular migration and to increase the number of returns. Mr. Speaker, Sweden will continue to build security together with others, particularly as a member of NATO and the EU. Sweden pursues an alliance policy based on solidarity that aims to strengthen security and stability in our neighbourhood and throughout the Euro-Atlantic area. We will maintain a strong national defence capability to contribute to both national and collective defence. Sweden will take its responsibility for fair burden sharing within NATO. The transatlantic link is crucial to Sweden and European security. It must never be taken for granted. European NATO countries need to take greater joint responsibility for the defence and security of Europe, and this includes the support to Ukraine. Bilateral relations between Sweden and the United States are excellent and are strengthened by us being NATO allies. As a partner, the United States is of particular importance to Sweden and to Europe for trade, security, and politically. Cooperation with strategic allies, such as our Nordic and Baltic neighbours, the United States and the United Kingdom, is especially important for Sweden's security. We are developing our strategic partnerships within the EU with Poland, Germany, and France. With Sweden as a NATO member, the Baltic Sea, Nordic Atlantic and Arctic regions are fully intertwined. Sweden now has a greater responsibility and reason to engage in Arctic issues and develop its High North policy. In 2024, Sweden held the presidency of the Nordic Council of Ministers and chaired the informal Nordic and Nordic-Baltic Foreign and Security Policy Cooperation formats, N5 and NB8. This strengthened the cooperation with our Nordic and Baltic neighbours. Security cooperation in our neighbourhood should be intensified further. Together with Finland, Sweden has taken the initiative to utilise the Council of the Baltic Sea States, the CBSS, for security policy dialogue. The former president of Estonia, Toomas Ilves, and former Lithuanian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Gabrielius Landsbergis, will present a report ahead of the ministerial meeting in May. We want to see the CBSS as a regional security policy format that also includes Poland and Germany. In these uncertain times, one thing is certain. In our region, we stand together and we stand strong. Mr. Speaker, this year will mark 30 years since Sweden joined the EU. The EU is a community of values and Sweden's most important foreign policy platform. A strong EU gives Europe strength and Sweden a stronger voice on global issues. Our priorities in our work in the EU are clear. They are the major cross-border issues of our time and our continent: war, crime, climate, and competitiveness. It's a matter of defending our prosperity and our security. The EU is crucial to securing long-term and robust support to Ukraine and to constraining Russia. The EU also plays an increasingly important role in strengthening the defence industry, military mobility and civil preparedness in Europe. Moreover, the EU is key to imposing effective sanctions. Sweden has pushed for sanctions against Russia's Shadows fleet and liquefied natural gas, and for using the extraordinary revenues generated by immobilized Russian assets to support Ukraine. Sweden has also contributed to establishing a new sanctions regime against political oppression in Russia and to imposing sanctions on Belarus based on the oppression there. The government supports the Belarusian people on the path to a free and democratic Belarus that is a member of the European family. Sanctions require effective enforcement. The government works continuously to strengthen national efforts, and in the coming months it will present a bill to the Riksdag with proposals for a new act on international sanctions. This will expand the range of punishable offences and increase penalties for sanctions violations. The EU's continued enlargement and cooperation with partners in our neighbourhood are essential to our security and our economy. The EU enlargement is a geostrategic investment in peace, democracy, security, stability and prosperity. It is in our interest to help the candidate countries to move closer to the Union. The government is pushing for additional steps towards the EU membership for Ukraine and Moldova, which have both made impressive progress and reforms. At the same time, it's important that progress is also made in the candidate countries in the Western Balkans. Sweden supports the countries, and this support is strong but not unconditional. Their pace of reform is decisive. The Georgian government's actions run counter to the values and principles upon which the EU is founded. Parliamentary elections in October were characterized by an uneven playing field, entrenched polarization, pressure and threats against voters. Violence against peaceful protesters is unacceptable, and Sweden wants to see sanctions against those responsible. We have to continue to support democratic and pro-European movements in Georgia. Sweden has a close relationship with the United Kingdom. It is important, particularly with respect to security policy. We're also actively seeking to enhance cooperation at EU level, and we look forward to the UK-EU summit in May.
Mr. Speaker, increased growth goes hand in hand with increasing Sweden and Europe's security. An economically strong Europe is a more secure Europe. It is the EU's single market and potential for trade that makes us attractive to the rest of the world. The government looks forward to the European Commission's new single market strategy. The conclusions of negotiations on a trade agreement with the European Commission and the Mercosur countries and a modernised EU Global Modern Agreement of Mexico are welcome developments. The government will continue to work proactively for additional free trade agreements. At the same time, the government takes a serious view of the risk associated with actors seeking to exploit vulnerabilities and economic dependencies. We see an increased need for international cooperation at the nexus of technology, innovation, trade and security. To harness the potential of new digital technologies, secure and dependable infrastructure is needed. Sweden is world-leading in mobile communication networks, and we cooperate with like-minded actors for secure connectivity within the EU and globally. In recognition of the increasing importance of cyber and digital issues, the government has adopted a specific strategy on these issues within foreign and security policy. A new national cybersecurity strategy will also be presented in the coming months. Mr. Speaker, developments in the Middle East are difficult to predict, but important steps in the right direction have been taken recently. Ceasefire deals in place in Gaza and Lebanon. The brutal Assad regime has fallen. Iran and its proxies have been weakened. The government supports Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas in the aftermath of the worst mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust. At the same time, we have made it clear that Israel has an obligation to protect the civilian population in Gaza and secure access to humanitarian support. International law, including humanitarian law, must be respected. Sweden supports efforts to secure the release of all hostages, drastically improve the humanitarian situation, and ensure that the ceasefire is lasting. The government is also deeply concerned by settler violence and the expansion of illegal settlements in the West Bank. Ultimately, a negotiated two-state solution based on international law is needed. This is the only sustainable solution in which Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in peace, freedom and democracy. A Gaza free from Hamas rule is a political prerequisite for this. Iran has played a major role in the negative developments in the region and security risks in the West. The government will not tolerate Iranian attempts to destabilize Sweden or orchestrate terrorist activities here via proxies. The fall of the Assad regime is an opportunity for Syria's people to shape their future and build a free, democratic country. The EU should contribute to a Syrian-led, peaceful and inclusive process in which all Syrian people's human rights are respected. Participation of women and ethnic and religious minorities must be ensured. Mr. Speaker, Asia and Oceania are the region where the greatest economic growth is expected. Moreover, the security of Asia and that of Europe are becoming increasingly interlinked. China is the world's second-largest economy and a leader in technology. At the same time, the country is under authoritarian rule and has growing geopolitical ambitions. China's conduct towards Taiwan is worrying, and threats of military violence are unacceptable. China's enabling of Russia's war in Ukraine has a direct negative impact on Sweden and Europe's security. We welcome a dialogue and cooperation with China where this is possible and in line with our interests and values for aims such as promoting trade on equal terms and tackling climate change. In parallel with this, we continue with the rest of you to draw attention to human rights violations. Sweden's relations with China must be anchored in a European strategy and close transatlantic cooperation. India is a key actor in addressing global challenges. Sweden advocates the conclusion of a free trade agreement between the EU and India. Sweden is intensifying its cooperation with Japan, which is an important country to NATO and a significant export market. Sweden's participation in the World Expo 2025 in Osaka will be a step towards strengthening the Swedish business sector's competitiveness in Japan and the region. Mr. Speaker, Swedish development assistance should create opportunities for better living conditions for people living in poverty and oppression. Development cooperation has a key role in efforts to make societies free and well-functioning and should focus on more areas where Sweden can provide clear added value. The government sees potential in identifying synergies between government assistance and trade to tackle growing global challenges. One example is the green transition. Sweden is one of the world's most generous donors of climate aid, and Swedish companies offer innovative climate solutions. Sweden is chairing the board of the Green Climate Fund in 2025, which presents an opportunity to improve the effectiveness of international climate aid. At a time when more than 300 million people are in need of humanitarian support, Sweden is one of the world's largest humanitarian donors. For 2025, Sweden is doubling the humanitarian support that previously went to UNRWA, allocating 800 million Swedish krona for the severely afflicted civilian populations in Gaza and the region. Moreover, we continue to address acute humanitarian needs in Ukraine and other crisis-affected places such as Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. In the midst of these crises, we also continue to push for humanitarian access so that aid can reach those who are most vulnerable. Civil society organisations are indispensable partners in all these efforts. Mr. Speaker, gender equality is a core value in Sweden's foreign policy. We are currently seeing the regression of gender equalities worldwide in countries such as Afghanistan and Iran. The sweeping and systematic oppression of women underpins authoritarian rule. Sweden's work is essential to increasing women's and girls' empowerment. Sweden development assistance must contribute to increased access to health and maternity care, comprehensive sex education, and measures against all forms of sexual and gender-based violence. This is an important part of our broad commitment to global health. In 2025, Sweden holds the presidency of the UN Women Executive Board. It is a unique platform to advance global gender equality efforts, through which Sweden will particularly highlight the importance of women's economic empowerment. Mr. Speaker, international law, including the UN Charter, is a cornerstone of Sweden's foreign and security policy. Sweden supports the independence and integrity of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Human rights and freedoms must be defended. The equal value of every individual, regardless of gender, age, sexual orientation, or religion, is a matter of freedom. A number of minority groups around the world, including Christians, Uyghurs, are being subjected to oppression. This is worrying when human rights and freedoms are undermined by authoritarian states such as Russia, China, and Iran, which seek to reshape them based on their value systems. Sweden will remain engaged in arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. Later this year, together with the Philippines, we will assume the presidency of the so-called Article 14 process, which will seek to facilitate the implementation of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Mr. Speaker, Sweden's diplomatic presence abroad is one of our main tools to assert our interests. The government has therefore conducted a review and can now announce several new missions abroad and other reinforcements. Sweden's presence in the United States has been expanded. A new consulate general in Houston will concentrate cooperation in key industrial sectors such as space, aviation, defense, energy, IT and life sciences. Our Consulate General in Brussels will be upgraded to an embassy, reflecting Belgium's role as an important partner for Sweden in the EU and NATO. In the coming months, Sweden will open a new embassy in Senegal, which will work to promote our interests in French-speaking West Africa and the Sahel. We are strengthening Sweden's presence in the Indo-Pacific region, which is important in terms of trade and security, with the addition of a new Stockholm-based envoy for the Pacific Ocean. We are also installing a Stockholm-based ambassador to Peru to further promote our relations with key partners in Latin America. Taken together, these steps aim to strengthen our partnership and improve conditions for trade investments and innovation. Last year, Swedish citizens Johan Flodérus and Said Azizi, who had been wrongfully imprisoned in Iran, came home to Sweden. The government will continue its efforts to secure the release of journalist David Isaak, publisher and poet Gui Minhai, and researcher Ahmadreza Dajali. Mr. Speaker, the government's foreign policy rests on Europe, Nordic, Baltic and transatlantic foundations. With a war being waged on our continent, our neighbourhood will be on our top foreign and security policy priority. At the same time, Sweden will maintain its strong global engagement. We will continue to work with the UN through alliance building, a long-term approach and determination. Our engagements and partnerships with key countries in Africa, Asia and Latin America are being further strengthened. We are facing a challenging time, a time when we must have the capacity to defend our interests and values to ensure that they are respected. Together with our allies and partners, we will counteract the authoritarian forces that seek to divide, dominate and destabilize our open societies. We will safeguard the cohesion of the democratic world, and above all, we will safeguard Sweden's freedom, peace and security. There is no task more important than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan Johansson from the Social Democrats, and Håkan Svenning, Kerstin Lindgren from the Centre Party, and the Jakob Risberg and Johan Forsellas for joiners. Morgan Johansson may begin to go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you also to the Minister for the Foreign Policy Declaration. I will get back to the main questions about the law of nations and international law and a shower of odd actions from the USA, but I wanted to start by bringing up the Middle East and the policy that Sweden is prosecuting there now. Last week we found out that, or earlier we found out that Sweden is dropping all core support to UNRWA. That's a flagrant violation of the UN line and Sweden's own line. Just a week or so before, we had said to the UN that UNRWA was indispensable to get help and support to suffering Palestinians. The government has said that all support to UNRWA may be meaningless because of the new legislation in Israel, and that money might just stay in a bank account, as you say. That turns out to be wrong. Despite Israel's laws, UNRWA has been able to work in Gaza. And during the 2 weeks of the ceasefire, UNRWA has reached 1.2 million people with food aid, opened 10 new tent camps for returning Gaza residents, repaired water lines and created waste stations, created mobile healthcare clinics that can take up to 700,000 healthcare applicants per day. The Swedish government was wrong when they said that UNRWA could not reach Gaza. UNRWA reaches those who need help. So my question to the foreign minister here is, when the government hears about all this, does the government intend to re-examine its decision and once again support UNRWA? Thank you, Foreign Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The humanitarian need in Gaza, it's hard to understand. And of course, this is still one of the biggest crises in the world, and there are also in the neighborhood a number of places that need support. And we, Sweden, we are a big important donor, and this is also something that has been stated in January, that Sweden is a humanitarian power force, and our aid alleviates suffering, and the government is continuously trying to ensure that every single krona goes to those who are in the biggest need. And we truly wanted to help alleviate the suffering. And we now have this decision for support to Gaza in 2025. And this is something that we're doing in order to try to meet that need and to do it in the best possible way. And you have to understand that this is targeted aid that goes over and above what we're already giving to several organizations that are already there in Gaza, like UNICEF and the International Red Cross and others. And through that type of flexible funding that Sweden is providing, we are ensuring that the partners could, after the ceasefire, double their efforts already the first day. And that is how we truly make an impact. And of course, we're going to continue to continuously monitor the developments. And we have over and over again criticized the UNRWA laws, because Israel also has an obligation to ensure that the organization can be active on site. But that is in no way any type of contradiction to the fact that we have to ensure that money goes to where it does the most good. And Sweden is truly making a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan Johansson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, but the government is wrong. UNRWA's emergency help reaches those in need, and we have also seen that underlined how important UNRWA is. Everyone else sees that. The EU backs them up. France does. Germany backs up UNRWA. Sweden fails the Palestinians when they need help the most, not just in Gaza, but also, unfortunately, in the West Bank. We have reports that CEDA is reducing its support to the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program, who follows Palestinian children to school so that they won't be attacked by militant settlers. It's been working in the West Bank for 20 years. It's very important. CEDA is eliminating support as a direct consequence of the government's policy. How will Palestinian children go to school when they're attacked by settlers daily? The foreign minister must answer. Why is Sweden failing the Palestinians when they need our help the most?
Slutreplik, utrikesministern.
Final rejoinder, Foreign Minister.
Thank you. I do believe that Morgan Johansson didn't listen properly to what has been said. Sweden has doubled its support to Gaza and the region, the humanitarian aid, and that is to alleviate that suffering in Gaza and also in neighborhood areas. And we ensure that this funding goes to where it's supposed to by providing it to actors in the region so that they can reach these children and alleviate that famine that's suffering. We have doubled that support. That concludes that set of rejoinders, and we continue with Håkan Svenneling from the Left Party.
Mr. Speaker, the foreign policy declaration contains many things, but one person that the foreign minister specifically wanted to avoid mentioning is the new president of the United States, Donald Trump. Last week, Trump presented plans for the U.S. to take over Gaza and continue the occupation that Israel and Netanyahu's government had initiated. Trump also clarified that the inhabitants of Gaza, the Palestinians, shall be expelled to neighboring countries. Instead, Gaza will be purchased and owned by the USA and remade as the Riviera of the Mediterranean. This is a shocking violation of international law, and the settler movement must be celebrating. I wonder what the foreign minister thinks about that proposal to forcibly expel Palestinians from Gaza, because how will Sweden maintain international law when Trump and Netanyahu want to break it? The ICJ has stated that third countries, such as Sweden, must make sure they do not support Israel's occupation of Gaza. The Swedish government has consistently failed to realize what this judgment means for Sweden. Instead, we have increased our weapons trade with Israel, everything to make permanent the occupation of Gaza. These ties must be cut. The genocide must have consequences for the Israeli state. We see at the same time Trump initiating sanctions against the ICC. 2 weeks ago, we heard that the EU was using its power to stop Trump's occupation of Gaza. What are we doing to stop the occupation of the sanctions against the ICC? Thank you, Foreign Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My foreign policy focus is about looking at different interests. This is different from the previous government, and we need to also have that collaboration regardless of who is in power. And we have the same interests as the US president. We want the best for our countries. And there is one important fact, which is that Sweden and the US, we have many things, many interests in common, international trade, security policy amongst those. And then, of course, there are other issues where we have other different opinions, and then we will stand by our values. When it comes to Gaza, Gaza is a home for those who reside there. And we know that there's an enormous need for rebuilding, and they need support from the world around them. And this is part of the agreement that has been made. And Sweden, we're clear, we need to have a lasting ceasefire, and many countries will need to assist in the rebuilding of Gaza. And we have to remember that the United States has been a key partner in ensuring that we have a ceasefire, and will be important in the future as well. But we need to see a two-state solution and a rebuilding of Gaza and Palestinian state. This is an important part of it. And I did hear the news last week, and this is worrying when it comes to the International Criminal Court and their ability to act to we have to do what we can to alleviate those sanctions and to provide support to the court, and we support them in every possible way. Thank you. Håkan Svenneling.
Mr. Speaker, in Denmark, foreign policy is now being changes. Saying that the USA is the most important ally no longer works when Trump is threatening to take Greenland militarily. The transatlantic link has gone from being a chain to a leash that Trump can use to bring the Christensen government to heel. It is time for Sweden to suspend our DCA contract with the USA. We cannot give the USA access to 17 military bases in Sweden. The same thing applies in the Middle East. Time after time, Trump has shown that he only intends to do the bidding of Netanyahu, who's been accused of genocide. We must react against these statements like building the Middle East Riviera. We have to have a road forward that gives clear support to the Palestinian state and most of all to the Palestinian people. Thank you, Foreign Minister. Final rejoinder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all know what stand for. The left, you do not support NATO and what they have to say about nuclear weapons. You do not want us to be part of NATO. You want us to be alone and defenseless. And this is something we see over and over again. And your excuse this time is who is in charge in the United States of America. We have, and this is different from what has been stated by the left, that there are no such bases with nuclear arms that will be placed in Sweden without our consent. And I will always work for Swedish interests, and I will not just focus on the domestic debate. That concludes that set of rejoinders, and we continue with Kerstin Lundgren from the Centre Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard a fairly cautious foreign policy declaration, and perhaps we can understand that in consideration of the security situation we're in. We can agree from the Centre Party that many parts of this are correct. Russian is a threat. Belarus, Georgia, and candidates states are some examples. Support for Ukraine is a moral duty, but if we say that that is a moral duty, then it is a duty. The Centre Party has long expected the Swedish side to do what France has done, sending air power to Ukraine. We are expecting the government to make a decision sending JAS fighters to Ukraine and training pilots, but we've waited for a long time. Can the foreign minister tell us today whether that will be happening? We've also said 1% of our gross national product yearly should be used to support Ukraine. The government, with its package, has used a lot of our annual support package for Ukraine. It's too small. Mr. Speaker, I have read the declaration and looked for the climate threats influence on our security, and I find climate one time, Mr. Speaker. It's in the context of cooperating with China. Mr. Speaker, the climate threat is really here. In 2030, 130 million people are calculated to live in poverty because of climate development. The most affected countries are also the most fragile countries. This is a basis for new threats, new conflicts, new wars. The climate question, however, is absent from the foreign minister's foreign policy declaration. Why? Thank you, Foreign Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been very clear. I've already stated that our most important task is giving support to Ukraine, and we now have the biggest military package that we have provided, and we will stand by Ukraine as long as necessary. And the collaboration that we have with Nordic and Baltic colleagues, that is also decisive, so that we can reach out into Europe, because there are many who can do a lot more, including the countries that have already been mentioned in this debate, but also other parts of the world, because this is when we have to fight for international law, so that the big and mighty cannot steal that power away from others. And of course, we will continue to continuously evaluate how we best provide support to Ukraine. Now we're focusing on other types of systems, and as Kerstin Lundgren knows, this is something that we are focusing on, and we're also preparing so that we can send JAS fighter planes if we have to Ukraine, because Ukraine is our most important task. Kerstin Lundgren is also mentioning climate, and climate is incredibly important as well, also politically. And I've also mentioned this, the climate issue, and I've said that it's important that we work in an efficient manner so that we can look at international climate support, because because that is decisive so that we can get to those big emissions. And here we have the dialogue with the US, China, India, and Turkey. That is decisive as well. And that is why we feel that is so important to discuss also in bilateral discussions with those countries. And I've already also mentioned the work that we have in the Arctic region, which is closely linked to the climate issue. And that creates, well, new opportunities and also new threats, as is. Thank you. Kerstin Lundgren.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Foreign Minister. It's obvious that there is more to do as far as Ukraine and support for Ukraine, and we have given a number of proposals that I hope the government also listens to. As far as the climate, this is a question that is notable for its absence, and really why I did not hear the Foreign Minister say. However, the Arctic is something I heard, and the Arctic is of interest, Mr. Speaker, because we have demanded for there to be a new Arctic strategy. The old one from 2020 is still in effect. We have demanded and expected for there to be some news there, but no, nothing was said. Neither was anything said about Greenland, actually, which is something where we must be very clear that we do back up the EU position as well, standing behind Denmark. Mr. Speaker, I hope that the Minister has some news in the Arctic question to deliver now. Thank you. Thank you. Final rejoinder, Foreign Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure if Kerstin Lundgren is going to think that it is a big news when there is a very intensive work carrying on with, in particular, the Arctic in question. We're also in close collaboration with other Arctic countries, and there's also very intense dialogue amongst NATO countries, which naturally we're going to which in NATO we called for the High North, which is all the more strategically interesting with countries that we have to keep an eye on, such as China, not the least. So this issue is going to be. I'm going to work with it intensely. I can actually guarantee Kerstin Lundgren, and we would work with her as well. Thank you very much. Thank you. And then that was the end of those rejoinders. And now it is to Jakob Risberg, the Green Party. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Foreign Minister, for the foreign policy declaration. It was a long list of things that are happening around the world, but I thought that ambitions and vision was lacking. What does the government actually want to do? It feels like we don't really know what we're doing in our foreign policy, because are there any types of ambitions? If there are, it's trade, increasing trade. We need to increase trade with the USA, with Eastern Europe, or East Asia and Latin America. Lots about trade there. However, trade will never be able to replace the need for foreign aid, because trade does not reach those in the greatest need, those who are most vulnerable. Trade can also be used to affect things in different ways. In 2 weeks, the foreign minister with the EU's other foreign ministers will make a decision on prolonging the import prohibition on items from Russian-controlled areas of Ukraine. We need to stop the trade with occupied areas. Do we recognize this from somewhere else? There is an occupation of Palestine going on, which has been going on for at least 58 years, but we still permit imports of goods from illegal Israel settlements. We've been very quick to take decisions on prohibiting goods from Russian-controlled areas of eastern Ukraine, but we have still not made a decision on prohibiting import of goods from Israeli-occupied areas of Palestine. So here is something that I would like the foreign minister to run a question: how can we stop import of items from Israeli-occupied areas of Palestine? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Speaker.
Egentligen av två.
Thank you. This question is in two parts. First, he says that he doesn't understand why the trade is so important, and that doesn't really surprise me. I'll come back to that. But then he wonders why we will still trade with Israel. Well, if we start with the first part, then it is no news that the parties, including the Green Party on the left side, do not understand the importance of trade in the world and not understand what I'm saying in the Foreign Policy Declaration, that there are clear synergies between trade and also aid, because it is trade which increases our welfare, well-being, and also increases our opportunities and possibilities to help those who absolutely the most need of help. But if you don't understand this very fundamental connection, then it is extremely difficult to have a debate on the importance of developing trade. And it also explains the actions from many other actions as well, to put it that way. And then, of course, when it comes to Israel, we have been very clear in our criticism, when it has been needed, and we are very concerned with the violent settlers in the West Bank, and also we've had numerous debates in the chamber on this, and I also answered the other question, and it means that I now welcome the council talks in the 24th of February. That is a great opportunity to look at the difficult questions related to the war, and at the same time as we can also handle other issues then and there. That channel for dialogue, and ever since that has been here in the Parliament, and it's also been critical to using it. But I'm convinced that we need to have more direct and honest, open dialogue, and not just this kind of flat politics. Thank you very much.
Jakob Risberg,
Jakob Risberg, Green Party. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Foreign Ministry. I know that trade is important, but the foreign policy has so many more parts than just trade. It's about getting people out of poverty, diplomatic relations, and so on. There are so many questions, other types of question in the world than just trade. It's great that the council, the Association Council, has been brought up. It took 8 months, but what red lines does Sweden have then as far as this Association Council? When are you prepared to put it on pause? Will you require a prohibition of import on items from Israeli settlements? Will you require a changed law on UNRWA from Israel? Will you demand a total stop to settler violence? Will you ask them to stop settlements in accordance with the international community's judgments? Are you going to require their withdrawal from occupied areas? Will these be areas Sweden will be making demands? Thank you, Foreign Minister.
Thank you, Speaker. We were very clear that the government is behind the International Court and the statements that the court has made. And this is something which we are always bringing to the fore in our dialogue with Israel. But it's also easier if you actually do have a dialogue. So I welcome that, truly. And then we're going to also put forward criticisms on the actions in the West Bank. I also can state that there are different labels on products that come from there, and that's something that I think is good. We've talked about that in various debates before. But I also want to be very clear that we right now cannot look backwards but forwards, and we've got a very some kind of a ceasefire. It's a little bit weak, but we're going to try to bring down suffering. But also, it's an important step to negotiate a two-state solution so that the people finally can live in peace. Thank you.
Tack. Därmed var replikskiftet.
Thank you. With that, the exchange of rejoinders, due to the Foreign Policy Declaration, is finished. Morgan Johansson from the Social Democrats has the floor for his statement. Go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This year marks exactly 80 years since the end of the Second World War. This was a war caused by right-wing extremist nationalism in Germany, Italy, and Japan, which cost the lives of over 60 million people and also led to the worst genocide in history, the Holocaust, where of Jews, Roma, homosexuals, opposition, and anyone else that the Nazis didn't think fit their new Third Reich. It was a global catastrophe of a type never seen before, but out of the ash of the Second World War, a new world order grew forth. It's not that all countries became democracies, that was not the case, but at least most world leaders, democrats and dictators, came to understand the enormous risks of an unregulated world order, risks that additionally increased many times with the invention of the atomic bomb. Never again, we said, and set up an international regulations and global and regional institutionals to maintain those regulations, anything to reduce the risks of a third world war, which would be devastating for humanity. So we had the United Nations, the Council of Europe, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, the Geneva Convention, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and so on and so forth. Eventually, even the European cooperation that would become the EU, we created a rule-based world order grounded on the world law of nations and international law. And even if we then had many wars, we have been spared a new world war, and we can thank the rule-based world order for that. For 80 years, we have maintained that stability, and now it is threatened. It is, of course, threatened by Putin's Russia through his attack on Ukraine almost 3 years ago, through his claims on land areas in Moldavia and Georgia, for example, and his attempts to infiltrate politics in a number of EU countries and the Balkans. Russia is and remains the main threat against Europe for the foreseeable future, and we must build a bulwark against that. But, and we might as well say this flat out, the world order is now undermined actually also by the new American administration. You cannot say anything else after the spectacular moves of the latest weeks. For USA to take possession of Greenland, for Canada to become a state of the USA, for USA to take over the Panama Canal, for the USA to take over Gaza, forcibly expel millions of Palestinians from their homes to make place for some type of vacation facility for Westerners, and the latest, USA demanding access to Ukraine's natural resources, otherwise they won't continue to support Ukraine, but rather in practice sell out the country to Russia. And I think many people are thinking, what is actually happened? Has the world gone crazy? In situations like this, there's only one thing to do, and that is to take a deep breath and go back to the basics, the law of nations and international law. There are words for wanting to take possession of other countries. It's called imperialism and colonialism. And we thought that belonged on the trash heap of history. And there are words for wanting to expel millions of people from their homes. That's called ethnic cleansing, and forcibly displacing a population, as is clearly being considered in Gaza, is a criminal act under the Statute of Rome, Article 7, under the headline Crime Against Humanity. And blackmailing a country, Ukraine, which has been at war for 3 years, which has lost thousands of its countrymen, seen its children taken away to Russia, to blackmail that has been subjected to all the crimes in the war crimes in the law book, to blackmail such a country requires a special type of ethics, or the lack thereof. How low can you sink? These things are deeply destructive. They split the West, play into Putin's hands and undermine the rule-based world order. The international community, EU and Sweden, must be very clearly as far as these plans. We cannot accept millions of people in Gaza and the West Bank being driven from the land they've lived on for generations. We cannot accept agreements being made over Ukraine's behind Ukraine's back. We cannot accept the rule-based world order soon being just a memory. Who loses the most in that? Well, first, small and medium-sized countries. Great powers will always be able to assert themselves, but for small and medium-sized countries being able to claim their rights, we require a rule-based world order. But by extension, Mr. Speaker, a lot more is at stake. If the world goes back to the pre-war order with a war of everyone against everyone, with chaos and anarchy and the right making might making right, then the whole world's foundations will be shaken and we don't know where it ends. We have to build broad global support for the rule-based world order. I think the Swedish government has been far too vague, silent and passive in the challenging situation we are in. For example, I think that they should have been much more clear when Trump made his move on Greenland. We can never accept an ally threatening another ally with violence, and we must express that immediately, and immediately give Denmark and Greenland all the support they need in such a situation. But the most serious mistake is that Sweden, under this government, has pulled out of the global arena to entirely focus basically on Europe. And this expresses itself in many ways. They reduced support to the UN and its organizations drastically. They no longer prioritize UN work and are abstaining in important votes in the General Assembly. They've reduced foreign aid drastically, soon under the line of shame, 0.7% of GNI. We are pulling out of Africa and Asia, and in the Middle East, entirely dropping support to UNRWA, drawing down important foreign aid in the West Bank, and flagging in support for Palestine. This is an enormous mistake. Now that the rule-based world order is shaken, we can't just focus on Europe. On the contrary, we have to build broad support for the rules and institutions that have maintained stability in the world for 80 years. The world is greater than Europe, and it is more important than ever for Sweden's government to show that we understand that. Thank you. Thank you, Morgan Johansson. The Sweden Democrats are Emerson, Magnus Persson, the Christian Democrats, and Joar Forsell from the Liberals. Asked for rejoinders. First is Aron Emerson from the Sweden Democrats. Go ahead.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Basically, it is wise that we have an order in Sweden and in the Riksdag that we have fairly an agreement on foreign political issues. This is also to our advantage in the political situation in the world. But the Social Democrats has made like a trademark on themselves and to try to say that they always have to change, always to be reactive and always think something which they never thought before. We've seen a lot about insecurity policy as well. We've seen a lot of political areas as well. And now Morgan Johansson says that we're going to go back to the basics in a situation which is the worst since the Second World War. But it's the case that it underscores the Social Democrats' utopian and reactive foreign policy, which means that they're going to change their minds on certain intrinsic issues. The Social Democrats do not seem to have noted that a new reality means that we have to have new realistic means or measures. And when we've compared the democratically elected, for example, Trump, and compare him with, for example, Putin, who is and also on this issue with Greenland, for example, and of course we in the Nordics And from the Swedish side, we have diametrically opposed opinions when it comes to certain foreign policy issues, not the least about Greenland, where we should be clear in saying that Denmark's and Greenland's issues are our issues as well. We agree with that. But to compare a leader such as Trump with the world's biggest, with one of the world's biggest criminals is completely against also the policies that we have with Denmark and so forth. So I don't know how Mr. Morgan thinks that he is in line with our policy. Thank you, Morgan Johansson, Social Democrats.
Thank you. Aron Emilsson and the Sweden Democrats perhaps should not be the one to talk about other parties changing what they say. What I said during my address was that we always have to stick to the rules-based world order, always. And for everyone, there are no specific rules for a specific country. No single country can claim the territory of another country. No country can threaten another country with violence to gain other resources. This is obvious, I would say. And doesn't matter if it's the United States, Russia, regardless what country, we have to be specific and say, no, this is not correct. I was, last time we had Trump as a president, I was the Minister of Justice, and I was in that situation for 4 years. And I was also involved in a number of situations where we heard from the US president and the US administration. And my experience is that we have to respond in a very clear, quick manner, or we'll get overrun. And now I would say that it's worse than ever. It's not just Greenland, it's Gaza, it's Ukraine. There are so many things that are going on. And then it's even more important to stand firm and stand by the rules-based world order. So, did you claim that we should abandon that rules-based world order, that we should have different ways we act compared to what country we're talking about, the US or something else? I would say that this is something that's very dangerous, and we might end back in a place that we saw before the wars, the world wars. No, we have to stick to the rules-based world order. That is so extremely important. Aron Emilsson.
Thank you, Speaker. The rules-based world order is self-evident for me and also the Sweden. And I know how many times I've repeated that, and here in the chamber as well, that in the media and other junctures, that it's perhaps the most important thing that we have as a middle-sized state in Europe. That we don't agree that having put other states on duty in an imperialistic way, such as Russia and others have done, and China, which makes also certain African states dependent on them and so forth. This is the problem, and the rules-based world order is essential. But if we also consider that we have to also take a stance on that working against extremism and the terror that today is an international problem. When Israel is a state in the front to hold back that terror, and then we have to talk about the situation in Gaza is a children's cemetery and so forth. And there's all that rhetoric and that have. In what way is that good for a discussion? That if you're trying to also look at a rules-based society in these regions as well. And this just smacks of anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I'm trying to say is that we have to have the same rules applying for all countries. When Israel occupies land that they're not entitled to, we have to demand that they withdraw. And if there's warfare that is unproportional, we have to say something. And if the US tries to claim a territory of other countries, we have to say something. And now Russia is involved in this horrific war against Ukraine. We have to say something, but we cannot treat different countries differently. And that is a slippery slope if we start to accept things. When we hear requirements like these ones, we will end back in a situation similar to the ones we had before the world wars, and that would be something extremely serious and dangerous. So we have to fight for the rules-based world order. Thank you. Thank you. That concludes that set of rejoinders, and we continue with the Foreign Minister and the Moderate Party. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has been very clear in several junctures that Denmark and Greenland decide on issues that pertain to them. And we also said that hours after Trump's statement, and quite unlike Morgan Johansson's lies on the radio this morning. But I disagree with Morgan Johansson's so-called foreign policy word. It is clear that he has not had contact with his Social Democratic colleagues in Denmark. But it's not the first time that the Social Democrats in Sweden do not know what's going on. All these foreign and security debate are going at their Nordic sister parties. The Social Democrats didn't understand what the S in Finland did with NATO because they were so involved with their own political game. The government in Sweden has been in constant contact with colleagues in Denmark and we've done exactly what they have asked us to do when they have asked us to do it. And both the Prime Minister and I have expressed Sweden's support to the messages that the government of Denmark has made in these issues, and we are wholeheartedly behind our neighbouring country. Why doesn't Morgan Johansson do what he said in his presentation is the best to do in this difficult time? That is to say, take a deep breath and perhaps also take the mobile phone and call the colleagues. Thank you very much. Morgan Johansson, Social Democrats.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can ensure the Foreign Minister that we are in dialogue with the party friends in other countries. I'm also in the Foreign Committee and I'm discussing with the Danish equivalent and same thing with Finland. We were discussing during the NATO process as well. And we've had ministers going back and forth between Sweden and Finland so that we can talk about and coordinate what we're doing. And I have to say that it was a bit of a surprise what we heard from the foreign minister when I criticized Trump and what he had said. It took several days, by the way, before we got a proper comment from the prime minister and the minister for foreign affairs. It was very quiet for several days. And once we had a reaction, it wasn't really the government position, but instead you attacked me because we had said that we have to support Denmark. And then it was us somehow that was responsible for saying something that was totally obvious, as a matter of fact. Regardless who criticizes whom, and I was surprised. But I do think that the foreign minister now, when you see other and hear other statements about Gaza, about other places, perhaps you're beginning to understand that Trump, well, when you want to handle that situation, the only thing you can do is to be very, very clear. And I hope that you will be in the future. And thank you. Foreign Minister.
Thank you, Speaker. It is clear that Morgan Johansson only looks at the media and looks up his own name. It's clear that he doesn't actually keep up with what the government has said about Greenland and when we've said it, but only when it comes to looking up things about himself and about his own party. And it's even worse. if he maintains that he's had contact with his Social Democratic colleagues in Denmark, that he then, it completely goes against their wishes, whereas we naturally listen very carefully as to what our colleagues in Denmark say. I want to go back to the speech that Johansson made. Did one denote that he spoke more about Trump than about, for example, EU, which is our most important foreign policy platform? It is somehow symptomatic of the social Democrats that they are not capable of navigating in a very difficult security policy time. The only that they can do is to take quick points in internal politics and not to put Sweden in the first place. Thank you very much. And final rejoinder, Morgan Johansson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It could be that the foreign minister is getting praise here when launching such an attack. That might be. But I do not think this is a proper way to work with foreign policy, considering the difficult security policy situation that we're in. And stop being focused just on one individual. Focus instead on the difficult challenges that we're facing. And here we have as challenges the fact that the rules-based world order is threatened by Putin, but unfortunately it's also being undermined by the US administration. And that is what we should focus on, not attacking individuals. And the only thing I want is that we're clear with statements that are being made so that one understands where Sweden stands, that we stand behind international law and the rules-based world order. Thank you.
Tack. Därmed var det replikskiftet.
Thank you. That concludes that set of rejoinders, and we continue with Magnus Berntsen from the Christian Democrats, please.
Tack, herr talman. Socialdemokraterna har traditionellt.
Thank you, Speaker. Social Democrats have always supported the UN systems, also very critical of the state Israel during the war in Gaza, also before that, and also during and after. And that's why I'd like to ask how his stance is to the UN statements. And let's look at statistics now then. In the UN General Assembly between 2015 and 353 resolutions have been aimed at Israel, whereas 71 resolutions pertain to all other countries in the world. During 24, the General Assembly took on board 70 resolutions against Israel, and only 6 were about the rest of the world. And one was about North Korea, and one was about Syria and Myanmar, Russia, and the EU, and So I think it's very difficult to say that this is the world, this is the state of the world. Statistics cannot only be because the conflict between Israel and the Palestinian act is one of the most difficult conflicts. There's many countries that are voting on these resolutions have a long history politically and ideologically of an animosity against the state Israel, and not often dictatorships which have very questionable views of human rights, that persecute dissidents and refuse women's rights and don't agree with free media. So my question to Member Johansson: does the member feel that this is this disproportionate criticism of Israel, and why is that? And if not, how does the member then explain this strange division of the resolutions passed in the UN? Morgan Johansson, the Social Democrats.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The simple explanation, I guess, is that this is the longest conflict that we have seen. It goes back to when the United Nations was founded back in the 1940s. So it's a protracted conflict. And this is a question that we'll have to get back to time and time again, because it hasn't been solved, and there's nothing strange in that. But then what you're saying is that we have criticized Israel. Well, yes, we have criticized not the state as such, but the warfare that is unproportional. We have criticized the occupation, and we do the same thing when it comes to criticizing other actions that are unjust. And we want to see a development where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side, a two-state solution. And for that to happen, for us to get there, then the occupation has to stop and the settlements have to stop. And I know that you have been in contact with the settlers, and I know that you have also stopped the contacts that you used to have. And this, as a matter of fact, is one of the main obstacles towards a long-term peace in this region. And I think we've never been unbalanced in our criticism. Israel, the state, has a right to exist within secure, internationally recognized borders, but we also stand up for the Palestinian state and a solution. But then the occupation and the illegal settlements have to stop, and also the type of warfare that we see today. Thank you. And Magnus Persson, please.
Speaker, for anyone who's defending the rules-based world order, then it is an institution then which role is to maintain international law, and but is there the risk that it would also lose its legitimacy if its actions are seen as one-sided and politicized? I can understand that Israel is, but we've seen also that that also bosses of UN. Teachers' unions in Gaza and so forth, that they have leading roles, the leaders of Hamas and many other things. But I want to be, well, having said that, I want to say that my party thinks that Israel doesn't always take the right decisions. So we are very critical about the settlers issues. But to the question, doesn't the member think that the UN will lose its legitimacy when its criticism is so one-sided, as statistics show? Thank you. Thank you. Final rejoinder, Morgan Johansson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I actually believe that Israel has lost that legitimacy after what we have seen recently. And the UN, on the other hand, has not lost its legitimacy. And I do believe, well, you talk about settlers, and as a matter of fact, I don't think that our opinions are too far apart. A Palestinian state and an Israeli state that can function side by side, but both sides have to work in that direction. So we should work together. And I think that if we have that positive starting point, I think that we can actually accomplish something. Thank you. That concludes that set of rejoinders, and we will continue with the Liberal Party and Joar Forsell.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you to Member Johansson. The Social Democrats haven't actually really got a strong history by standing for the rules-based world. Quite the opposite. I mean, one can consider Palme's passion for Castro, or how Morgan Johansson's predecessor put on or dressed up as someone kind of in mind. But now, when the rules-based world order in particular is challenged by the evil axis of China, Russia and Iran together, then one wonders what the Social Democrats are doing and what the Social Democrats in Sweden are doing to correct other Social Democrats out in the world. I have three questions to Morgan Johansson. What are the Social Democrats in Sweden doing in order to stop the Labour government in Great Britain's the plans for a great mega embassy from China, that it was going to be like a spy base for China's activities in all of Europe? I wonder, what are Social Democrats in Sweden doing in order to ensure that the Social Democrats the led government in South Africa stops also to kowtowing to China. They said that they're behind also they support China's claims on Taiwan, regardless of how China wants to do it. And finally, what do the Social Democrats, what have they done in order to drive the Social Democrats with the Scholz in Germany to have refused to send Ukraine the weapons which Ukraine has needed and have refused to let Ukraine use those weapons that they have received in a way that the Ukraine needs in order to win the war. So Social Democrats in Sweden have a lesson to learn, and they should also need to get a little bit more responsibility on what Social Democrats in the various parts of the world do. China, Russia, Iran are the biggest threats against democracy in the world. Thank you. Thank you. Morgan Johansson, Social Democrats.
Tack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can ensure you that we are in a dialogue with the sister parties, and then, of course, we present our opinion. When it comes to the United Kingdom and China, I find it a bit difficult to see what the problem would be with a Chinese embassy. Why wouldn't they be allowed to have more of a presence in the United Kingdom and South Africa? And well, we'll go there just in a few weeks, and I think that we then have an excellent opportunity to discuss both relationships with China and Russia as well, because that is another discussion that has to be had. And Germany, then, what you're saying, Your Forsell, as a matter of fact, it's incorrect. Continued support from Germany to Ukraine, that is from Alternative für Deutschland, the extremist party that is gaining influence in Germany. That is where we see that difficulty. Your Forsell, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And those of you that are listening and hearing this, you hear how lightly the Social Democrats take what's going on in other countries, how lightly they take the big embassy that China is planning to build in Great Britain with support from the Labour country. It's like a spy hub for all of Europe. It's not an embassy. It's an embassy that's going to be the center of a hub for Chinese support, oppression in all of Europe. It's going to let's see, thousands of Brits have protested against it on the streets of London. Hong Kongers in exile, people from Taiwan, they demonstrated because this is an enormous threat. But the Swedish Social Democrats just ignore it. You can't just wave away the problem with Scholz, the lack of weapons and how they can use them has been a threat to Ukraine and their ability to win the war. Thank you. Morgan Johansson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I remember correctly, the Rebel Party was in that government, not the Social Democrats. What you're now talking about and the problem with not giving enough support to Ukraine. And maybe we'll hear more about that when we come to your address. But all countries make their own decisions as to what diplomatic relationships they want to have. And I find this, well, nothing strange that China has an embassy in London or in Sweden. Or am I to understand Your Forsell as him wanting to change that? I hope not, because my opinion is that we have to maintain diplomatic relationships, and we need to do that in a broad way. And Your Forsell, I think that you're headed in the wrong direction, quite simply. And we have to cherish the contacts that are necessary for us. Thank you. And that concludes that set of rejoinders, and we will continue to the speakers. And the next speaker is Aron Emilsson from the Sweden Democrats, please.
Mr. Speaker, the foreign policy debate is happening at a time which, as we know, is strained, conflictual, unpredictable, movable. Authoritarian regimes are stretching the limits of our international order. Old truths are becoming new truths. Trump is challenging international law and the sovereign rights of countries. Huge international catastrophes like Sudan are drowning in the previous lines of conflicts. It is the nature of politics, if we think about this. Today, the goals and priorities and for the Swedish Democrats is that political realism to be first and foremost. We need realism in Swedish politics. It's not reasonable to think that Sweden donates the most money and therefore we have the most influence. Historically, it's been just the opposite. Since the 2022 election, Sweden has had a foreign policy that, to a greater extent, is based on Swedish interests and priorities instead of utopian expectations about how reality could be adapted to the socialistic mind map. Our party conducted a thorough evaluation of this. We have associated it to expectations from opposing parties, trade, our engagements, humanitarian aid could be central in our development politics. Our work has been positive. I am happy about how the work has been proceeding with the Tito parties and will in the future. Mr. Speaker, the Nordic cooperation is prioritized, which you knew. Together, the Nordic-Baltic circuit creates an axis of like-minded countries. Together, our countries coordinate. We are efficient and orderly in our international cooperation. Together, we are on the front lines of a responsible foreign policy. We note that Greenland's and Denmark's cause is ours. Together with Poland and others, we lead the support to Ukraine tirelessly and faithfully as long as we are needed. Our blue and yellow people is working for our cause in the East, and that is where our defense lines are. Regardless of where the wind is blowing from, regardless of where we are, we meet new and old threat pictures, traditional and new warfare, hybrid warfare. Antagonists like Russia, China, and North Korea are manifesting at all points of the compass. With financial and military cooperation, they help each other conduct war and aggressive intelligence collection all over the world linked to each other. This is also the context on our own continent. Russia's capacity is strained, but survives thanks to its shadow fleet. North Korean soldiers are fighting in Europe. Iranian drones make life unbearable for civilians in Ukraine. The Russian influence in the Middle East is there, as well as China's and Russia's expansion in Africa and Asia. In this situation, the EU lacks a clear leadership, even though we have great confidence in the EU's new foreign policy council and its focus on winning freedom and seeing Russia lose and of doing what's necessary for that. We will meet the serious security situation wherever it is. We will compete in the space race, which has been more and more a arena for great power competition. And Sweden has good conditions to, in defense and civilly, compete. If we look down, we see underwater warfare, not the least in the Baltic Sea, has escalated recently through sabotage, hybrid warfare, serious things have happened. It's threats to our infrastructure, air, travel, etc. Obviously, we need international communication. We cannot be impeded in this worrisome time. We need to look at the Nordic perspective. We have to have eyes and ears in the archipelago. This is vulnerable for foreign powers. There are clearly regional perspectives and international perspectives on this. I myself know as a person who lives in the archipelago where the Swedish Navy was founded. Actors that have turned out to be both one thing and the other have been shown up there. Together we will be strong. In the Nordic countries we need each other. The EU needs the USA needs the EU. Russia and China are cooperating to rip up the rule-based international order. And the EU to get the EU to act reactively, we need to talk to farmers the way farmers talk and to teachers in Latin, as they say. We need to work for a favorable situation where the rule-based world order is challenged. We have common foes. We need to think about relationships, trade, defense, security, competitivity. We need to stretch out, express our belief in the future, be clear, not the least in Canada's dialogue with the USA. This has been shown. Sweden needs to maintain a critical profile. We have to say that the EU is needed both more and less than ever, more in questions of cross-border issues, trade, foreign policy, security cooperation, and so on, much less in the form of domestic meddling, extra fees, heavy administration, a burden when we need to support our industry, defense industry, and innovation in our union in relation to other global actors. We need to strengthen and structure cooperation with other parts of the world, Japan, Philippines, Asia, other countries in Latin America, Thailand, Asia. We need to work with democratic countries in vulnerable situations in the shadow of communist China or Islamic terror movements, which also work on the international stage and which are our problem. There are good opportunities for increased cooperation, not the least concerning trade, innovation, research. The situation for Israel and Palestine, there is every reason to support Israel after the worst terror attack against the Jewish people since the Second World War. We need to work for the release of hostages and supporting the fragile ceasefire and eliminating the terror of Hamas. Mr. Speaker, the Nordic cause is ours, and together in the world, together in the Nordic region, we can work for the rule-based world order. Thank you very much. Thank you. Håkan Svenneling from the Left Party, Kirsten Lindgren from the Center, Jakob Risberg from the Greens, and Joar Forsell from the Liberals have asked for rejoinders. First is Håkan Svenneling. Go ahead.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, the Sweden Democrats and what they think about the developments in Syria, that's not quite easy to understand. It seems like different Sweden Democrats have different opinions. To start with, you're the only party that visited the Al-Assad regime through Matti Kinnaman and also previous members of the Foreign Policy Committee. And right now we have two written questions where we question what is happening in Syria. What will happen to the minorities? Will their rights be protected? And you have another Sweden Democrat who is worried about the settlement policy that we see in Kurd-dominated area, but Turkey, where we see different violations, kidnappings, for example, where they try to scare people off. And what is being said here is that the settlement policy goes against international law, and this will create new conflicts in Syria. And there is a member who agrees and says that Syria today is one of the most unstable regions in the world. But then we have other members in your party that write in articles that it's a matter of concern that we cannot deport people to Syria just because of the security situation not being excellent in the entire country, and they try to get that EU ruling changed. And we've also heard from other members of your party that 180,000 people in Sweden should be deported. This is like a Swedish version of Donald Trump. And we see what is written from the Foreign Department, where there still is a ban on deporting people to Syria, but your evaluation of the situation in Syria seems to be different.
No.
Aron Aronsson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Håkan Svenneling, for the question. Yes, naturally, it is the case that many people are committed to the Syrian question, and not the least in our members in the Riksdag and the European Parliament for a long time, and long before, we had discussions and processes before the NATO entry, not the least, as far as influence that Turkey exercises in Syria, for example, in relation to Christian minorities, how they have related to the Kurdish autonomous regions. This is not a problem that has disappeared now that Syria has gone through a revolution and the Assad regime has been thrown out. Naturally, many people have great faith in Syria developing in constructive direction now for people to be able to return and rebuild their own home country. And this is not at all opposed to the assessment we have today of the security situation. Sweden Democrats have a assessment of the current security situation, but we also hope for a dialogue with that government as soon as the situation allows and things have been stabilized sufficiently. We want to get more and more promises about, also being able to act constructively and not persecute Christian minorities and others that would return. Yes, there is an ambition. We have a goal for people who are living here today and do not have citizenship and have not been integrated in Swedish society and perhaps, for example, come from Syria, should be able to return to rebuild their own old home country. Many want to. There was almost public celebrations. Lots of people wanted to return to their old home countries as soon as it appears secure to do so, which appears to be a future we can hope for. We'll see. Thank you, Håkan Svenneling.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do think that this is about one single thing. The Sweden Democrats you do not care as to how well established you are in Syria, in Sweden, or what the security situation is like in Syria. You just want people to disappear from here. And we have seen 14 years of war in Syria, and now they need assistance from the world around them. And we need to increase the support, not sanctions. We have to be clear when it comes to Kurds, and that they should be entitled to rule their own areas, to have autonomy in those regions. And we need to provide our support. We have long relationships with Syria. And we have thousands of Syrians who have sought refuge in Sweden. And we have a responsibility to now contribute to a new democratic Syria.
Aron Emilsson.
No, Aron Emilsson. Yeah, right. Thank you. From the Sweden Democrats has the final rejoinder. Yes, exactly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, and of course, with that conclusion and that last sentence that Member Svenneling has just stated, rebuilding a free and independent Syria, there's no opposition to that from the Swedish Democrats. In that case, it would be a racist policy not to let people return that wanted to return and rebuild their old home country, contribute to societal development, reunite with their old relatives. I think that Svenneling would not oppose that, and a lot of people would have that as a goal if they've lived in exile for a long time, to want to return, to want to rebuild the country's economy. That's the polar opposite to, whatever superlatives you're using in foreign policy. But naturally, we need to solve the immediate security situation, but also see that things develop in the right direction. And we also want to see this developed later in the debate. Thank you. Thank you. Therewith, that exchange of rejoinders is finished. Kerstin Lundgren from the Central Party may bring her rejoinder. Go ahead.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm a little curious. I was listening to Aron Emerson, and I wasn't quite hear those usual words. And I'm wondering, Mr. Speaker, because earlier collaboration did not include foreign policy, and I'm a little bit curious. Is it the case that the Sweden Democrats are behind the government's foreign policy declaration statement? Are they? Is this the case? This is my first, and it's easy to answer that, whether it's yes or no, whether they're for it. And then we have two declarations that the Sweden Democrats also have supported. The one is about that we're going to get rid of the legal help that we give to Hong Kong, as Hong Kong is not separate from the Communist Party agenda. I would have expected that they would say something about this. I would have expected that also the other announcement that we were going to also support Taiwan with House of Sweden and to scale up our relationship with Taiwan. I would have expected that to be more visible now when either in the government's declaration or statement or also in the Sweden Democrats' speech. But none of that, I heard none of that. And, Mr. Speaker, the third question that I'd like to mention to the Sweden Democrats is that the terrorization of the EICG, that is one of the clear signals that this chamber has given to I didn't hear anything about this or anything in the Sweden Democrats' presentation either about the IRGC. What do you understand it? Are you still behind this issue? Why isn't that on the agenda? Thank you very much. Thank you, Aron Emerson, the Sweden Democrats.
Thank you for the question. What I noticed now, most clearly in this, is that the government and the Sweden Democrats have coordinated and created a Swedish policy together. This is an important part of our policy. Otherwise, there are no regulated agreements in foreign policy. The government has a greater room to say things in its foreign policy declaration. It's not a Sweden Democrats product. And you note that there is in the declaration good opportunities to move forward. We can see this through constructive dialogue. Then it is the case that Taiwan, which was mentioned now, I did mention in my statement to say that it is important that we need to seek increased cooperation with countries like Taiwan. This has been our soapbox for a long time. We have had positions and takings of positions on this, both as far as House of Sweden and strengthening a number of different diplomatic relations, exchanges of students, business relations, etc., etc. There's a lot more left to do, as well as in defense industry cooperation and security cooperation against China, of course. But as far as the terror listing of the IRGC and Iran, this is basically a Sweden Democrat position that this chamber and the Riksdag have adopted. There was a motion that was supported by the Foreign Policy Committee. We had moved to give IRGC a terror listing. There should not be any differences in opinion between us at this point. We will support that point. Thank you. Thank you, Kerstin Lundsen Center. Go ahead.
Herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Did Mr. Speaker hear a yes or a no to the question posed about the foreign policy statement, whether that was also was accepted by the Sweden Democrats? I did not hear it, Mr. Speaker. I heard larger freedoms for the government. That sounds as if it's someone who provides a certain amount of space that Sweden Democrats have that position. That would, in that case, be exciting to know if that were the case. Then I also heard now in the IRGC and the House of Sweden, Taiwan, nothing about the other agreement. And why the government has been there for a number of years. Why hasn't the government managed to take a position on these areas which the chamber has called for? Why haven't the Swedish Democrats driven ahead on these and have been a response from the government? Tell me. And final rejoinder, Aron Emilsson, the Sweden Democrats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kerstin Lundsen knows that being part of a cooperation means compromising, and the other parties here are views, and we bring them up. But much of foreign policy is a government prerogative. The foreign policy declaration is a government product. There are a number of questions where we have coordinated and come to an agreement, not the least as far as the important area of foreign aid. So this is not a difficult question to clear up, and that's where we are. We have a number of possibilities to come to shared views with the Centre Party. Questions that Ms. Lundgren brings up, terror listings, Hong Kong, China, and not least the strong support for Taiwan, a number of areas. I see great potential there, so there is no opposition between us in that question. Thank you. Thank you. That exchange of rejoinders is finished. Member Riesberg for the Green Party. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Aron Emilsson, for the presentation. One noticed that when you have to make speeches, that 8 minutes is quite a short time on this topic, especially with a view to that the foreign minister gets 20 minutes to speak. So there are a lot of things that one doesn't have time to bring up or expand upon. But I'd like to mention a little bit on one of the issues, and that is that the Sweden Democrats today are not as open for Donald Trump as they were a number of years ago when they were nominating him for the Nobel Peace Prize. But before they've been inspired by him, a political movement that just threatens democracy and the rule of law and so forth. But a delegation also went to the US states to get hints about their campaign. Now, I'd like to hear about the viewpoints of some of Trump's statements recently. During the first weeks, then, Trump wanted to expand American territory with Greenland, Gaza, the Panama Canal, and he wants to leave. He's left the WHO and the Paris Agreement and so forth. And also and a number of other things, just a number of the foreign policy statements which can have very long-term consequences. So I'm wondering, what does the member say, Aron Emilsson, about Trump's new foreign policy line? And this is something that perhaps I would have missed in the presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Aron Emilsson, Sweden Democrats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To begin with, yours truly and Morgan Johansson discussed these questions at PM Morgon this morning, where we talked about the Trump administration and how to work in this new political security situation. There's a lot to say. The text has a lot of it. What we can note is that the Republicans, as a constitutive movement, and Trump in his foreign policy have a lot in common with the Sweden Democrats as far as foreign policy and how we should support industry and enterprise and how we work on the domestic arena. And then as far as foreign policy, there is a lot that separate us. And both from the Swedish side, the Sweden Democrats, and the Nordic side, there are a lot of dividing lines between us and the new Trump administration when it comes to how we should see national states and nation states and as autonomous areas, regions' ability to be autonomous and make determinations about their security cooperation and so on. Naturally, this concerns Greenland, the Panama Canal, how we see the trade war with friendly neighboring countries and so on. Just as I mentioned, I think we need to be better at overall party lines and also in Europe at reading the new administration's language to be able to show what our expectations are and show clarity, strength, and ambition in what is to come. Because this is a transactional administration. We can be standing in a corner with our foreign policy in the cupboard, and hope that Trump will be okay. But what we also can try to do is look for constructive cooperation, because Russia, China, Iran, and much more we should be able to agree on. Thank you, Green Party.
Thank you. I listened to that on the radio. I didn't have time. But I have another question I mentioned that, which Member Emerson mentioned, that's about Israel. And we know that Sweden Democrats have, of course, have a very warm heart for Israel. But the party is not that they're very, very present because they have their Nazi kind of roots, but But about the rules-based world order, I'd like to just ask: did the Sweden Democrats think that the occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, and is illegal, and that Israel, in accordance with international court statements, should dismantle the settlements? Thank you. Thank you, Aron Emilsson. On the final rejoinder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, on many occasions we have declared our view of the Israel-Palestine problem and the regional conflict in the Middle East, and it's obvious that we need to be able to keep several thoughts in our heads at the same time. For the first thing, Israel is a well-functioning democratic state in the Middle East, a frontline state against international horrible terror, which the Islamic terrorist movements are, not just in that close vicinity, but also with sympathizers in our own country. Therefore, we support them clearly. We also care about and stand up for the ceasefire that is fragile now and which should last, which should lead to better conditions for the civilian population. But also, hostages need to be released. And the international community has a constructive dialogue with Israel. Once again, if we are to succeed, we must both understand the opponent's argument and argue in the same language. There's a lot we can work with here, but our support for Israel, as well as for the civilian population of Gaza, is clear. Thank you. Thank you. That is the end of that exchange of rejoinders. Your Forshell for the Liberals, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to Member Emerson for the presentation. One of Ukraine's highest wishes now is to be a member in the European Union, and it is no coincidence. It is the case because through our common Europe that we big strength, and not even a country that is as big as Ukraine is strong on its own. And I have a question to Aron Emerson Aron Emerson says in his presentation that he would like a leaner and a sharper. He says he's a Nordic. That I'm happy. I'm also a Nordic. But I also note that in Norway, the debate with membership has really taken off, and not just because of the situation in Ukraine, but also because of the new administration in the US. In Iceland, within a year, they're going to have a new referendum on EU membership, and because there are more and more that can see that this community is so important. Earlier, the Sweden Democrats wanted to leave EU, and now they've changed to expand membership. But although some do want to take away the EU flag behind us here in the chamber, that's been said as well by them. But I wonder if it isn't the case that the Sweden Democrats finally have changed their position properly, and as Aron said, that they want to have a leaner and a sharper EU, and that they want to be in the EU. Is that the change, and they don't want to leave EU? That would be good news for me and for everyone who believe in the rules-based society, who believes that Sweden is stronger together with others. Thank you. Thank you. Aron Ebreson, Sweden Democrats.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Yor Forsell, for the questions. Yes, the Sweden Democrats struck the exit requirement in 2019 in relation to the previous ambition to leave the EU, so that's been a while now. Quite correct. This is something we do not pursue today. However, it is of great value, I believe, to get the EU to be slimmer and sharper. There is a form of both administrative, bureaucratic overbuilding that now exists. It has been extremely unfavorable as far as the EU's possibility to meet the disadvantages in competition regarding China and other countries which are strong on the world market and which have an entirely different way of relating to the EU and its agreements. And whether we have thrown wrenches into the gears of research and industrial development, it's much too much of a symbolic politics, we think, among other things. So it is definitely the case that EU, well, is needed more than ever today. You might not hear Sweden Democrats saying this often, but this is because of the security situation in the world. We are not strong alone. We need a strong Nordic area in the EU and a strong EU in the world in these questions. These days, we have a movement on the left wing and the right extremist wing, which has an odd way of relating to Russia in the war with Ukraine and to the sanctions instrument to try to outmaneuver them and make sure that Ukraine wins the war. We have previously noted opposition on the left wing, but also right wing, but also the left wing in this question. Thank you. Thank you, Yor Forsell.
Mr. Speaker, it's known that the Sweden Democrats wanted to took away that they wanted to leave it, that they wanted to evaluate membership, and many have interpreted that the Sweden Democrats have wanted to speak to both the voters that don't think it's so important to be in the EU and those who want to leave it. Perhaps to not just. It's perhaps also been important internally for the Sweden Democrats, this issue. But, Mr. Speaker, what we now see in this debate is that Aron Emerson is moving the positions further. The positive rhetoric that we've heard from Aron Emerson, we've never heard this tone before from the Sweden Democrats. And that is why I wonder if one thing about this change in position, is it the case that today here in the chamber we see how the more radical Sweden Democrats, perhaps Tobias Andersson is critical to EU, that they've lost a battle again within the Sweden Democrats. Do the Sweden Democrats permanently change to rhetoric and will be more positive in reverse to what they thought before? Aron Emerson, Sweden Democrats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, well, it is kind of entertaining to hear Yor Forsell's argumentation about where we are and why, but I won't make such a big deal out of that. I will stand by what I said. The Sweden Democrats are an European thinking party with an EU profile. I think you must realize that. There are many countries that have a leadership that works constructively in the EU that are of the view that the EU needs to be slimmer and sharper. For me, this is about sound and balanced reasoning in your view of the EU and what it should do. You should not be working to put ice on your own lawn or something like silly like that. It needs to be working for a security situation. And just as I said, the EU is needed less as far as domestic meddling in countries' internal affairs, but more as far as foreign policy cohesion. Thank you. Thank you. That is the end of the exchange of rejoinders because of Oral Emilsson's speech. Håkan Svenningsson.
Herr talman!
Mr. Speaker, now when we write the year 2025, we're in the middle of the 2020s, and it could be relevant to stop and think about the times we're living in. This is a restless time. Some have called it a time of gravity. We've gone from the time after the terror act on the 11th of September 2001 with security and anti-terrorism as the driving force for political change. The US's war in Afghanistan and Iraq led to results which the world still today fights with. That our world would have been more secure feels completely impossible to say after the beginning of this year in Sweden, and in particular with the svenska in Örebro in mind. But now we have instead come to a new time, a new era, to the return of the imperialists, a time which looks very much like the 1920s and the 30s world order, with economic crisis, military and also fascist streams, and in a time when politicians, regardless if they're democratically elected or dictators, that show the same arrogance towards international law, international world order, instead the own interests and to expand their country, their sphere, their imperium. We see it in Russia. For example, instead of living in peace, attacks and invades neighboring Ukraine. This despite the country's long historical ties to each other. First in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and eastern Ukraine, followed by the full-scale invasion in 2022, in a war which is still ongoing after 3 years. We see it in Turkey. Despite the fall of Assad in Syria, Turkey poses a daily threat to the Kurdish-dominated areas in northeast Syria through its extremist mercenaries. A Turkey that has for a long time acted as a border crossing for ISIS terrorists to control and undermine a democratic Syria. But now a new Syria is taking shape, a regime with links back to al-Qaeda, the very people who were supposed to be fought in the war on terror. We see it in China. For example, Hong Kong has in a few years, gone from a democratic hub to a totalitarian one-party state, where Taiwan every day feels an increased threat from its neighbor. We see the number of violations of airspace and maritime borders, cyber and hybrid attacks are on the rise. At the same time as the Taiwanese people are showing resilience and have elected political leaders who are clear about both democracy and independence from China. We see it in Israel. For example, following the horrific attack by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023, a government and a military that have sought to wipe out all human life in Gaza through the deliberate starvation that has been classified by international courts as a crime against humanity and the genocide that we have all seen before our eyes. Meanwhile, Israel has attacked Lebanon, Syria, Yemen and Iran, and a stable peace in the Middle East now seems very far away. But now, at last, the ceasefire has finally arrived in Gaza and shipments are finally arriving, but there is still no permanent ceasefire or real peace. We see it in Iran, where the call for freedom and also for women to live in peace, and after that, and at the same time as the Iranian IRGC also feed the proxy actors and dictatorships around the world. And we see it in the United States, where Canada is to become the 51st state according to President Donald Trump, at the same time as military threats have been made against Panama and Greenland by the same president. But Gaza has to be made into a riviera for other countries, and from a historical perspective, Trump's claim to territory is linked to a long American history of territorial claims and power grabs, a history that Trump now wants to be part of. Greenland is a Danish colony ever since Denmark took control of the icy island in 1721. The Danes have had a colonial approach to the island and its people. The surreptitious sterilization of Greenlandic women by Danish doctors is just one of many colonial examples throughout history. As recent as 2009, Greenland received its current self-government act, but the fact that Denmark has treated Greenland badly does not mean that it should become a new American colony. Greenlanders should decide their own future, and as both Greenland and Denmark, Danish leaders have stated, Greenland is not for sale. But with Putin, Netanyahu, Xi Jinping, and Trump, we have political leaders who threaten the imperialist threats against people who want to live in peace. It is an imperialistic wind that we thought belonged to another era. It is the return of the imperialists. Mr. Speaker, what then should Sweden do to stand up against the return of imperialists? What should Sweden do to stand up for democracy? Well, so far, the Swedish right-wing government has engaged in wishful thinking, not to upset the president. His entourage of billionaires has been more important than criticising than fighting back against his policies. The Swedish government prefers to remain silent about the fact that there's shrinking democracy, pushing on back women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and device to work. But the world's most richest man has had a right to shut down the world's biggest world aid. And this is like being an opposite of a Robin Hood story. And the Swedish Parliament approved a military agreement that gives the US the right to an American presence at 17 military bases in Sweden. The DCA agreement. In the debate at the time, the Left Party's argument that Donald Trump could become president was dismissed. Now it is a reality that the Swedish people have to live with. Sweden did not become safer with the DCA agreement. Instead, we gave an authoritarian president power over our country. This is shown not. The Swedish government must send a clear message to Donald Trump and the rest of the world. And myself and the Left Party claims that this agreement has to be suspended as long as Trump is in power. With him as president, the USA poses a direct military threat to our neighbours, Greenland and Denmark. Swedish military collaboration has to increase safety and security in our close regions and not the opposite. And the transatlantic link has gone from being become a lead that Trump can pull on to get people to do what he wants. Mr. Speaker, now the global South is critical of Sweden. Sweden has been, and there are different imperialists meeting. There are different consequences. In order to have more confidence in Swedish foreign policy, the government has to react powerfully and clearly for international law. With the ceasefire in Gaza, also the foreign minister has to make a to-do list to be able to make this work move on. And also, we have to take patients from patients. Just as we support Ukraine, we have to also save Palestinian cancer patients and children. We have to increase support, and cutting support and aid is not the right way to go in a restless world. And also to try to have sanctions against Israel, and also for the genocide and also the threats that they have done. Maintain that Israel has a the government has a responsibility and take them to the international courts and have a plan for a two-state solution in the Middle East. To stand up to imperialists, regardless of which country they come from, is important to turn the development with diminishing democracies and to put justice, peace and equality in focus once more. Thank you. Thank you. And Håkan Svensson's procession, Sachin Lundgren, Centre Party, Magnus Bernsson, the Christian Democrats, and Joar Forssell, the Liberals, have asked for rejoinders. And first, Kerstin Lundgren, the Centre Party. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wasn't planning on asking for a rejoinder on Håkan Svenneling, but then I heard what he said towards the end of his address. And then, well, there was this old rhetorics that we've heard before. We heard it when we discussed NATO membership, and we heard the left saying that, well, the US, here we have to sound the alarm. And we've seen that there is some sort of hatred towards the United States. And, well, that is the old rhetorics that seems to be gaining interest again. But, Mr. Speaker, our security, that is what we have to focus on. And our security has to do with the fact that we are now NATO members. And as part of NATO, we have to stand up and fight for the order that we have agreed upon. And here we have this agreement. This is something that is important for us, our security, and it's also important for our Nordic neighbours. It's important for our entire region. We have the DSA agreement, Norway has one, Finland has one, and so on and so on. Denmark as well. So this is one way to create security. And if we want that rules-based world order, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We have to safeguard this. And I'm surprised, or rather not surprised, that that is what Håkan Svenneling is trying to do. You're trying to throw the baby out with bathwater. But we have to look at what we have in the world around us. And that is something the left has to do as well. Håkan Svenneling, Left Party.
Jag gillar USA.
Speaker, I like the United States. I like to travel there. I like the food and the culture. I like to play baseball. That's why I'm a bit sore right now. But I don't like the American politics. And I don't like it when Donald Trump is president. And that was with great concern when I realized that Trump could become president. And that is why I talked about it in the last year's debate on the DCA agreement. And I was one of the people that mostly some said to me that basically that you're just trying to think about new arguments to stop the DCA agreement and not what I was actually trying to do, to warn that it could be a reality for us that we are now within an agreement with Donald Trump as president. And what I think that the Danes now are thinking about a lot is try to which have been so close to the Americans, but where the soldiers has died most per capita in the war in Afghanistan. They've also sold parts of Denmark historically, and now they are still prepared from the American side to have a direct military threat. And I think against Denmark, and I think that when it says that we want to suspend the DCA is because bilateral agreements between Sweden and the USA, military collaboration, and it's also in the proposal that it's not in a way that we have the same rights as the United States. It's only we give the United States rights of 17 military bases in Sweden. It also says in the proposal about DCA that it's not about NATO, that it's not about specifically a part of NATO, but it's actually something that is a part of this. Moreover, and I had a lot of criticism about NATO, that we wanted to enter NATO, but I can now fully accept that it is a reality, and that is why I lead a delegation to NATO, which is actually next week, and it is a cross-political delegation, and we have to act, and we have to act with everyone that comes from Trump and react to that, but we should. That's why we should suspend the DCA agreement. Thachin Lundgren, the Centre Party, you have a.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That was what I was thinking, as a matter of fact, that Håkan Svenneling, that you do like the United States of America as a person, as an individual. But I have a feeling that your party, the grassroots of the Left Party, they do not share those feelings. I think there are many who are now applauding the old rhetorics filled with hate. And, Mr. Speaker, we have to be clear about this. We haven't given up. We haven't abandoned any territory to anyone else. We have the DCA agreement, and it's clear our constitution applies. It's a Swedish law that applies. We haven't ended up in a situation where anyone has demanded things from us where one could say that this is going too far, and we haven't spoken up. If that were to happen, I assume that we will not be quiet. Thank you, Håkan Svenneling, Left Party, final rejoinder.
Mr. Speaker, it's very difficult to summarise of what all the grassroots movements think about the USA, but I think that the hate rhetoric comes from Donald Trump and not from me. But to say that we still have all right is wrong. It was clear when we decided on the proposition DCA agreement. It is the case that American legislation should apply to American military staff and their families, and also suppliers to the American military. And it's also the case that it's going to be different parts of these 17 military bases, which are parts of the Swedish military bases, that Sweden doesn't have a right to go in and look at what they have in their storerooms. What does that entail? It means that on certain bases in Greenland, that the Americans decided to establish nuclear weapons during the Cold War, and Denmark didn't have a right or control of that part of their own area. That's what Trump wants to go back to. And that's why he's talking about Greenland in the way he has: a colonial attitude, an imperialistic attitude towards the world, and that's what we can see in the issue on Greenland. Thank you. And now the nationalists and the Speaker Christian Democrats, you have the floor, sir.
Herr talman!
Mr. Speaker, the left party throughout the year has had a foreign policy attitude where we've seen, for example, that they're against proposals in the European Parliament that we should speed up ammunition deliveries to Ukraine. But that is not what I would like to talk about. I would like to discuss the view on Venezuela. And back in 2020, Jonas Sjöstedt congratulated the win of Maduro. And then we've also heard the recognition of Juan Guaido as an interim president, that you congratulated him as well. But there was general agreement that this was a fake election. We have also heard Malin Björk say no to resolutions where you condemn crimes that have been conducted in the country. And we've seen this over and over again. In the European Parliament, there was a resolution with a clear majority condemning the cheating during the elections, where Manzalevich should have been the legitimate president, but members of the European Parliament, they voted against that resolution, and however that was changed later on in a second vote. But I want to ask Mr. Svenneling, what is your view on the situation in Venezuela? Are you just condemning Maduro's regime and recognize the crimes against human rights? And if that is the case, why are you voting against those resolutions providing support to the people?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Member Bernström, for the question. I think it's very interesting as to how we can support a democratic process in a country where the political system has failed and there's an economic crisis and there's lots of migrant streams. I think it's very important for how Sweden also reacts and how it sees its foreign policy. I think that we have to recall that when we first in 2013, it was during democratic forms. That election did not get a lot of international criticism in that way, but 2018 and 19, it was clear that there were faults in that election, and I've heard clearly that was the case. And I was very clear, and like everybody else, that if you can't, we can't recognise someone, Juan Guaido, who was the legitimate president in Venezuela at that time, and that's why we have to give support to the political process, which is called the Barbados process, the Barbados, Mexico, and also where Norway also have, our neighbouring country, have been important in this political process. And this political process led to the last elections that were held last year, 24, where the opposition also participated in. But at the end of the day, when it came to the election day and also the counting of the votes, tallying of the votes, it was very clear that he still wanted to be re-elected. So that is why we've earlier in the party have said that when it comes to these written collaboration or contests with that, we didn't want to that we didn't agree with what happened when it comes to the voting in the European Parliament. We didn't vote against, as Bertrand stated. We abstained in the vote, and that means that the resolution from the right is too far-reaching when it comes to recognising a person who has not been elected properly. I think that one should give legitimacy to the political processes which lead to the fact that we can have a re-election, that the Western people can say who they want as their leader. Thank you very much. The Christian Democrats.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that reply as well. That is gratifying to hear what you're saying here in the chamber, that you have, at least to some extent, changed your stance. We'll see what will happen in the European Parliament as well in the future. It's obvious that the Venezuelan regime is not just trying to stay in power by cheating in elections and persecuting opponents. We also see that they try to make claims on neighboring countries like Guyana, and that they have that very imperialistic stance. And what we've heard from Mr. Svenneling, based on what you said in your address, it would be interesting to also hear you condemning the Venezuelan regime. That is something that I'm looking forward to, and I hope that in the future we will be able to see that you're clear in your opinions as other parties have been. And same thing with Cuba, and of course we have to continue our collaboration when it comes to Ukraine. Please.
Yes, I want to be clear, Mr. Speaker, with how they voted in the European Parliament. It was basically, I decided that from here from Stockholm, so no blame for that should fall on our European Parliament colleagues. We do need to be critical to the process, but we do not think that we should recognize leaders the way that was done. I am critical to the imperial process from Maduro, but I want to see both democratically elected leaders in the same way we see their, at the same time we see their imperial tendencies and so on. How do we counteract the economic crisis, though, that is striking the Venezuelan people? There is too much focus on the enormous stream of migration that has struck the Venezuelan people as a consequence of that. They've gone from being one of the richest to one of the poorest countries in South America just because of a political crisis created basically by Maduro, and that crisis has not been solved. Thank you very much. That is the end of that exchange of rejoinders. The floor is now to Joar Forsell for the Liberals. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Håkan Svenneling, for your address. And it's gratifying to hear, Mr. Svenneling, that you from Stockholm decide what is to be done in the European Parliament. And I actually have a question having to do with what the left is doing in the European Parliament. Listening to you, well, I understand that it's important with the collaborations, who you're cooperating with, and that is what drive politics. That was what large part of your address was about. And the most important foreign policy issue seems to be that Ukraine is to win and Russia is to lose the war. But in the European Parliament, the left is working every day in a party group where we have the Stalinistic parties, where members support Putin every single day in the European Parliament. And you're voting together with AfD, from Hungary, and that way you support Putin and you undermine Ukraine. That is what your party comrades from other countries are doing in the European Parliament. And the left, well, when you have been voted, you have been doing that correctly. I have to give you that. But you are allies with these extremists voting for AfD in Germany, etc., and voting for Putin against Ukraine. And if you think it's important with whom you collaborate, well, then it is about winning the war. But if you decide from Stockholm what members are to do in the European Parliament, shouldn't you leave that party group where we have those friends of Putin in Europe? Thank you. Thank you. Håkan Svenneling, Left Party, please.
Mr. Speaker, I think that we in the Left Party have actually chosen a very good strategy as far as Ukraine and the European Parliament, and that leaving the group we belong to might be the worst decision, and I'll tell you why. Jonas Svedstedt is now in the Foreign Policy Committee in the European Parliament, AFET, and he has brought up some of the most important questions. He is in the Ukraine delegation as one of the left's delegates for the European Parliament. He has been very clear that the shadow fleet is one of the very most important questions and brought it up at the European level and was behind one of the important resolutions that has gone through there. And I think, as far as the shadow fleet, that the Swedish government has been on its feet here. I hadn't had to do much more as a parliamentarian here, but as a member of parliament. But in the European Parliament is different. We had to bring up the shadow fleet. We knew that this was an odd group. We chose to work with the parties that have the same analysis as we do as Ukraine. We have reinforced our relations there. We have even hired Ukrainian left representatives in our group to get closer to them. And what we know is that with those that don't think the same way as us, we need to get closer to them. We need to make our arguments. So both in Brussels, and I'm going down to see them soon, but also when I participate in loads of conferences that the left has where we talk about peace, when I go to these conferences, there's this difficult person that's against things and says, I say, well, we achieve peace when we support Ukraine, as the foreign minister said in the foreign policy declaration. We support Ukraine in its negotiations so that there is not a bad peace with Russia when we do get to a negotiating table. We need to work against the ones that we have in our party group and not just put them aside. Thank you. Johan Forsell, Liberals, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do agree that sometimes it's beneficial to have a dialogue also with people that you disagree with. And that's often the case, that we do not agree with everyone, all the politicians in Europe, like the Liberals. But we also have to think about what is happening. And Russia is committing genocide and war crime in Ukraine. And wouldn't it be reasonable then to draw a line when it comes to collaborations? Wouldn't that be reasonable that you do not cooperate with Putinists? And I'm gratified to hear that you're doing what you do in the European Parliament with that shadow fleet. But the party group there voted against this, together with AFD in Germany and in Hungary, and that you from Stockholm, if you decide, you have to decide that you leave that group. Final rejoinder.
Mr. Speaker, I have no problem with Johan Forsell's description of history and how he describes the situation, but it feels somewhat remarkable as a Liberal to have issues with how we work in the European Parliament. We know that the Liberal Party, like other parties, mostly has problems with sitting in the same group. With the French Liberal Party, they tried to exclude the Swedish Liberal Party because they work with the Swedish Democrats here in Sweden. So I am happy to accept good advice on European cooperation. I perhaps do not have as positive a view of Europe as your Forsell does in some questions, but I think I will take that advice with a certain amount of certain grain of salt as far as cooperating with other parties in the European Parliament. I do want to note, however, that we are in Sweden's Riksdag, basically an agreement on Ukraine, and we should continue to work together. Thank you. Thank you. That exchange of rejoinders is finished. Kirsten Lundgren from the Centre Party, go ahead.
Talman.
Mr. Speaker, in our day and age, we have to manage war, climate crisis, and up until now we have had the faith in the world order that was shaped from the lessons of World War II, but this is now being attacked by leaders in autocracies and democracies alike. Sweden is an open country with free trade, and we now have to ask ourselves new questions. We have new challenges, and many ask, who can we trust? The Russian aggression war against Ukraine is now entering into its 4th year. And this was a war that was started 11 years ago with the Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And now we talk about this war having to come to its end. But, Mr. Speaker, then we have to learn from history. We cannot repeat history. Ukraine has learned. They stand up for their right. We have to do the same, and we have to do that together with Ukraine. We cannot have a Ukraine without Ukraine. And we have to show Sweden, the Nordics, Baltics, UK, the EU, all of us have to show that they can trust us, that we're a coalition of the willing. If weapons come to halt in Ukraine, it has to be because Ukraine wants that, because they believe it. It cannot be that they are under pressure or that there are promises that are not fulfilled. We do not want to see a new Munich, Budapest, or a new Minsk agreement, not a new JALT. That might be what Putin wants, or a newly elected president. EU will be tried and tested the next few years, and we, in Sweden, we have to ensure that the EU is involved in negotiations. We cannot have an EU without the EU. Sweden, like other countries, we have a bilateral agreement with Ukraine about security collaboration. We have to stand up for that. And the Centre Party has proposed that we take on more of a responsibility, that we give 1% of our GDP on an annual basis. We have demanded fighter jets, JAS, for a long time, and now we, together with the EU and NATO, we have to be prepared to create that credible deterrent. We have to give Ukraine that military, multilateral security. We have to do that, and we have to be on the side of Ukraine until the weapons grow silent. Sweden has to have a voice in the multilateral world order. We have many challenges, but this is something that has served us well. The UN is a cornerstone. Today it's wounded and exposed to significant risks. But we see how the foundation is being undermined, and we see the aggression from Russia, and that this is, as a matter of fact, a crime against the UN Charter. The newly elected president in the United States is talking about expanding the US territory, changing borders, and that is also going against the UN Charter. It might be just words, but these words are sending signals. If the US were to accept and recognize the Israeli borders with military means, that will mean a de facto cleansing of Palestinians, and that would mean that might go before right. And Sweden has to be clear. We have to be clear and speak up for international law. No limits, no borders may be changed with military might. The European Security Order, OSCE, is celebrating 25 years, and we have to stick the course. We know that we have a defense decision from 2024, and we see Denmark having a target of 5%, and we have to ensure that we now do our part for democracy and for our values in Europe. And we have with NATO more security, and we have more of a threshold when it comes to a possible attack. But the objective is to prevent war. Mr. Speaker, 2024 we saw new heat records across the globe, and that was the first time the average temperature went above the 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial levels. And we see the consequences across the globe with emissions with sea levels rising, climate change that is a security threat against us, the EU, the entire world. And this is a threat that doesn't stop, even if we have measures that are being taken and adaptations. But these are now being paused, which means that risks are increasing. And this climate change will lead to increased risk of conflict and war, and we cannot close our eyes. We have to do our part, and we have to provide support, not least to countries in Africa and threatened island nations. We have to go back to the level of 1% of GNI. We cannot just follow the US. We have to take our responsibility. We have to show solidarity where we have people that live in poverty and oppression. Each country has to do their part to create change, which means that we need education, sustainable economies, legal certainty, democracies. We want a world where children do not die from hunger, but survive, where they get education, freedom. And this is something that we're working for today. And Mr. Speaker, the foreign assistance is important for security policy as well. It's about promoting our values, peace, democracy, freedom. Unfortunately, this is being undermined by the actions we see from the government when it comes to the Middle East. We stand up for international law, for a Palestinian state, against settlements in the West Bank, and for UNRWA in the UN. Good. But at the same time, we see how the government holds support to UNRWA, i.e. a UN organization that has had that responsibility and has a mandate for all Palestinian refugees, has had so since 1949 in Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and also on the West Bank. And 1 year ago, we saw that the aid was stopped because of the review of UNRWA and possible links to Hamas. But after that review, the government found that one could resume payments. But then 1 year later, it's being stopped on the request of Israel. And the government is closing their eyes for the fact that UNRWA is part of a negotiated peace, shaping a situation with two states and recognized borders. And Sweden's actions have been noted by many countries, and this is something that threatens to undermine our voice, our position in the UN. Mr. Speaker, we see autocracies on the rise. The freedom and democracies that people live in are threatened, and we have to do what we can to defend these values, where we have authoritarian regimes and Russia, China, Iran, etc., and also with the new US administration. And 4 years, well, that might go by quickly, but we know that many things might happen. Russia, China, BRICS, well, we might see them being favored, and we have to stand up for our values. We have to fight for security, for freedom, for climate, for a freer world with more peace. And we have the following: Aron Emilsson from the Sweden Democrats, Håkan Svenneling from the Left Party, that have asked for rejoinders. And we will begin with Aron Emilsson from the Sweden Democrats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, Kerstin Lindgren is leading us on Merry Dance, thinking that we can agree on certain things. I was not actually planning to ask for a rejoinder originally, but when Kerstin Lindgren mentioned the Israel-Palestine conflict and UNRWA, and repeats this view that Sweden's actions in relation to the Israeli legislation and our own decision to cut off support to UNRWA, instead double humanitarian support to Gaza through other channels is problematic. I wonder whether it is Kerstin Lindgren's point, or whether she's saying that in the UN system, this odd duck, which has locked Palestinian refugees into permanent refugee status, should not, whether it is not whether humanitarian aid is not being able to reach them or whether she doesn't think it can reach those in need. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it is somewhat odd to hear from the Sweden Democrats that UNRWA is an odd duck in the UN system. This duck was created basically by our first Swedish peace mediator in the UN, Bernadotte, who tried to find a solution based on the positions the General Assembly had taken. UNRWA was the first organization that was created by the UN General Assembly in 1949 to make certain that a solution could be found that was in the plan that the General Assembly once upon a time had assumed, had decided upon. The solution was two states, one for Israel and one for Palestine, with secure and recognized borders for both of them. UNRWA is a part of the origin of the UN system and a foundation of the systems that have come later. What we can see now, Mr. Speaker, is also that UNRWA is still doing good work in Gaza, helping the World Food Program reach its targets with food aid. Because the reality is, as the government's representatives have previously spoken about, that UNRWA is the organization that can reach these places operationally in Gaza. But then we must remember, and I tried to remind you of this, that this is basically about a peace solution. The Palestinian population would not have been part of UNRWA if we had had a peace solution. A secure state for Israel, of course, and we should stand up for that, but also for the Palestinians to have their state. Thank you. Thank you. The Aron Emilsson for the Swedish Democrats has the floor. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I can hear, Kerstin Lundgren, that no, by extension, if we could have a two-state solution, then well, then we'll need that. But if the situation as it is, what I mean is that UNRWA is, we have a global organization, UNHCR, which works with the refugees and refugee help. And I still haven't heard from the Centre Party or anyone else in the opposition that about that just UNRWA, because UNRWA should ensure that humanitarian aid is sent there properly, and why that's because you can't just live on the old merits, and it's also it'd be important that the UNRWA's UN facilities and everything that also have to take into account that they also spread anti-Semitism for a long time in their camps, and the Centre Party doesn't look at that. So that why couldn't UNHCR then to have that role? Then the last rejoinder to Kerstin Lundgren, the Centre Party. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope that the Sweden Democrats and others can realize and see that UNRWA has another role beyond the purely humanitarian role. Their role is to secure education, trash disposal, quite a long list of things that would be the Palestinian state's responsibility if it existed. But the Palestinian state is very limited. They have a small part of Area A. As well in Syria, though, to ascertain in Syria that this does not destabilize the situation, the same thing in Jordan, or Lebanon for that matter. So we must make certain that there is an organization that can live up to the engagements the UN has made. And the UNHCR does not have that role. So this is really a question of peace for two states that can solve that task. Thank you. Thank you very much. That exchange of rejoinders is finished. Håkan Svenneling for the Left Party has the next rejoinder. Go ahead.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, I'll begin by thanking Kerstin Lindgren for her clear argumentation. I wanted to talk about the development in Georgia, where the democratic development is moving backwards after years. The Georgian Dream Party is reducing the area afforded democracy, and the member Kerstin Lindgren was one of those there as an election observer in the recent elections. We recently saw Georgian Dream withdrawing the Georgian delegates' rights, which led to Georgia not sending any delegates to the Council of Europe. The unlawful annexation by Russia of Georgian areas, Southeast Ossetia, etc., in 2008, has led to the Georgian Intermediary Council, G8, IC. We see political repression increasing day by day in Georgia. Georgian Dream has instituted a law on foreign agents aimed at the opposition and civil society, and it's clear in decision after decision that every political decision is a step closer to Russia and away from democracy. Those protesting on streets and in squares are punished severely by the police and by Georgian Dream, and we want a requirement for visas for Georgian Dream politicians to the EU. I wonder whether Kerstin Lindgren believes that the Parliamentary Assembly in its Article 4 should suspend the representatives for Georgian Dream. Thank you very much. Kerstin Lindgren, Centre Party, go ahead.
Thank you, Speaker. Georgia, unfortunately, is going very, very on the wrong path, and it's so basically discussions on EU membership have been put on the back burner because the direction is wrong for them. The council, I've followed Georgia for such a long time, and I've had such great hopes for the Georgian people's dreams to become members in EU, to be able to get NATO membership. We got a gold card together once from NATO, and there's been such a strong popular will to take these steps, but unfortunately, Georgian Dream, during Ivanishvili's also hard-handed leadership, has chosen to go in a completely different direction and to trick the Georgian people when they say that the Prime Minister said that we're going to be members in the EU in 2030. And that is all fake news, to be honest, and quite wrong the way they are reacting now. I'm prepared to look at the NATO association in this stage, but it's also important. And I've got many contacts, with many people in Georgia, and continuously. And I also want to I want to try to give hope and support and not completely shut the door. And that's why, because we don't want it to affect the Georgian people, but I could go further with the diplomats and people in leading positions, people who are acting brutally against the opposition, against the Georgian people. But what has to be go gently forwards, and I want to listen to what my contacts in Georgia are saying before I can land in that question. Håkan Svenling, the Left Party.
But, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to hear that from Kerstin Lindgren. I hope that together we can bring up this question in the Swedish NATO delegation, and that our delegation, together with others, can mobilize support in NATO's Parliamentary Assembly to discontinue rights for Georgia and clearly mark a changed way of relating to the party Georgian Dream now that it has become more and more authoritarian and opposed democratic rule. I think it is smart to include Georgia. I don't want to throw out Georgia entirely, but limit their access since they are showing these authoritarian tendencies. And I also think that we have a certain amount of time. It's February now. The first session for the year will be in May. So there are a number of months and space if we bring up this question on the agenda for the delegation and discuss seriously what measures NATO's Parliamentary Assembly can take against this authoritarian development in Georgia, and also to clearly point to the importance of democracy being a part of NATO. Thank you very much. Final rejoinder, Kerstin Linden for the Centre Party. Go ahead.
Well, for me, the contacts with both with the opposition and with my civil society contacts that I've had for a long time, they are extremely important. And they need a strong support. It's so important that they don't feel that they are just set aside, or that one can point fingers and say, look, you've got no support from them. And it's from that basis that before I can answer this kind of question properly, then I've got to have these kind of contacts first. But we'll see where we end up. But I think it's important to have a balance here. Earlier we talked about how we handle countries when leaders are going towards autocracies and dictatorship to try to support the oppositions there. And it is a difficult balance. It's important that Sweden does the right thing, and it's important that also in the NATO context that we do the right thing. But I think there's still some hope for many. Thank you. Thank you very much. And that was the end of that round of rejoinders. And now Magnus Benson, the Centre Party. You have the... No, I'm sorry. I saw Kerstin Lundgren for Magnus Benson, the Christian Democratic Party. You have the floor, sir.
Tack för det, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think we're going to try to say that the world is in a time of turmoil. Autocracies are challenging the rules-based order and the security we have for decades taken for granted is no longer self-evident. This is particularly true of Russia's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine, China, and also China's increasing aggressive stance against Asia and beyond, Iran's destabilizing actions in the Middle East, and also Venezuela's repression of its own people. Sweden has chosen sides in this tug of war. We stand with democracies, with the rule of law, with freedom, peace, human rights. That is why our support for Ukraine must be long-term and sustainable militarily, economically, and humanitarily and politically. So despite what is said today in Washington, D.C., now we need to be clear about where the real antagonists lie. Mr. Speaker, Ukraine must prevail, not just for its own sake, but because of the security of whole of Europe. It's at stake. If Russia wins, if Ukraine is forced to make concessions, it sends a message to every authoritarian regime in the world that aggression pays, that borders can be redrawn by force, that Sweden's support to Ukraine must therefore not be short-sighted. It's not just about individual weapons, systems or financial support today, but about a long-term strategy to help Ukraine prevail and then rebuild. We must support Ukraine's path to EU membership. We must ensure that Russian aggression has consequences, that sanctions are tightened, that war criminals are brought to justice, and that Europe's defences are built stronger. We know that Putin is betting that we in the West will tire, that we will become divided, that we will start to hesitate. That is why our response must be the opposite: persistence, unity, and determination. Mr. Speaker, in the Middle East, we can see glimmers of hope with a fragile ceasefire in both Gaza and Lebanon, and also that the fall of Syria's the Assad regime has fallen, but peace is far from being won. Hamas showed on the 7th of October 2023 that it is not a potential peace partner, but reminded the world of its true nature: a terror organization whose goal is to destroy Israel without compromise. Israel has accepted the deal to in the first phase, that hundreds of people, including life sentence murderers and violent criminals, will be released in return for welcoming home 33 adoptees, Israeli abductees. But from the hostages, we've heard that they were sometimes held in UNRWA's premises, but also that they spent hundreds of days in the terrorists' tunnels. Now, there are talks about releasing all the hostages and finding ways to move in the future of coexistence. The suffering in Gaza is great, has been great, and it is still great, and the hardship is still great, even though supplies are now arriving in much more in greater numbers, and no one is at risk of experiencing starvation. This has been, though, a totally unnecessary humanitarian tragedy, and Hamas cannot be allowed to be a player in the future when they have held an entire people hostage at the same time as they've tried to massacre another. And also what the Christian Democrats also believe that Israel must seriously address the unacceptable settler violence in the West Bank and stop the expansion of settlements. The settlements violate international law and undermine the chances of reaching a two-state solution, a negotiated two-state solution where Israel and Palestine coexist side by side, remains an only sustainable path to peace. Mr. Speaker, in Lebanon we now see a historic opportunity. The grip of Hezbollah and Iran on the country has weakened, and the area in which Lebanon served as a pawn in the games of foreign powers may be coming to an end. After years of economic collapse, political instability, sectarian oppression, the Lebanese people now need a president and a government that will stand up for the country's sovereignty, putting economic recovery and the rule of law principles above corruption and militia rule. Through the Sweden and EU can rebuild Lebanon as a functioning democracy where stability What is built as a functioning democracy where stability and prosperity replace decades of crisis. In Syria, Bashar al-Assad's time in power has come to an end, but the country's future still remains uncertain. The Syrian people deserve a future free from dictatorship and destructive Iranian and Russian influence. Sweden must stand with the people and work for a genuine transition to democracy and the rule of law. The years of war have left deep wounds, and Europe must not look away, but needs to do it. We need to do our part to ensure that Syria does not return to oppression or become a platform for new conflicts. It is clear that not the least Christians and other religious minorities are still in a risk of persecution and marginalization in the current unstable situation. Mr. Speaker, the Iranian people are being persecuted by their own government and its tools of the Revolutionary Guards, who arrest, torture and oppress their own citizens while at the same time arming all terrorist organizations in all of the Middle East. They carry out arbitrary arrests of foreign citizens and have even plotted the murder of Swedish citizens here in Sweden, and they support Russia in the war against Ukraine. And there are a few cities have not suffered terrorist attacks against civilians by Iranian Shahed drones. It is my firm opinion that the EU Circle needs to terrorize list the Revolutionary Guard. From the Swedish Parliament and government, we agree on this with the judgment in Düsseldorf as the legal basis for the shooting down of PS 752. The issue should once again be on the agenda of the EU's Foreign Affairs Council, the FAC. Mr. Speaker, I would like to comment on Sudan and the Great Lakes, the Horn of Africa, Latin America, Agenda 2030, the climate, world trade, and much more. But I hope we can return to this in other contexts. But my party colleagues Gudrun Brunegård and Youssef Aydin will participate in the next part of the foreign policy debate and will, among other things, talk about our views on aid and religious minorities and rights, respectively. I would like to round up by thanking the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the foreign policy declaration, which the Christian Democrats agree with. Thank you for the floor. Thank you. And now Magnus Bertsen from, and on this we have some comments, and Jakob Risberg and others. And first of all, to Morgan Johansson, the Social Democrats, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to ask Magnus Bertsen about the ecumenical accompaniment program in the West Bank, a program that has been run for 20 years. And the World Council of Churches and Sweden's Christian Council have handled that. 20 years it has been active in the West Bank, following Palestinian children to school, among other things, so that they don't need to be afraid of being attacked by militant settlers. They've also protected shepherds that have been very subject to violence. There have been destruction and theft of property, unlawful land confiscations. In under 20 years, over 20,000 Swedes have participated in that. Last Sunday, there was a notice from the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program. They visited a family in the Jordan Valley. The family told us that they sleep with their clothes and their shoes on so that they can flee if they're attacked by settlers during the night. It's happened several times that they woke to find settlers standing their tents. The little girl, Maza, told about a settler beating her brother the other day. Now, support is being discontinued to the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program because of the change in our foreign aid program. The CEDA no longer has that aid. When they are asked why they don't, they say it's because of the Swedish government and its aid policy. When I asked the foreign minister earlier, I did not get an answer. Perhaps Magnus Bertsen has better connections with the government than I do, so I want to ask him if he will work for the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program being able to be restarted. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Thank you, Speaker and Member Johansson, for the question. First, I'd like to underscore once again my that I how much I think it's important with the horrible violence in the areas in the West Bank, which is unacceptable and that has to be handled by all accounts. But back to the question which I got about the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program, CEDA has taken a decision on the basis of the new preconditions that have been given. We've made a big change of aid policy, and which entails that part of the support ends up more in the closer regions. When it comes to the support to Palestine, it was disorganized before. There were 122, I think, if I remember the figure, a lot more than 100 actors that received aid. But now that CEDA has looked at the situation, then a new decision has been taken. It is nothing that we, as a government or a party, have taken specifically, or rather, it is the other authorities have taken these decisions under the conditions that exist. But we also put questions on the basis of why this decision has been taken. I don't have an answer for this right now, but I can promise to do a follow-up on this as to why this decision was taken. But I have nothing that I can add to that in particular. Thank you. Thank you very much. Morgan Johansson, Social Democrats, you have the floor.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I truly hope that I can believe you when you say that you'll have a follow-up. And this is a question that has been asked. Why have you cancelled that support to this very important project, and SIDA says it is because of the government and their change in development aid, and that means that you now actually government can take an initiative to change the policy if you would want to, and we have to consider the increase of violence in the West Bank, and then to cancel that aid. I think it's horrific. How are kids there to be able to survive, go to school if they are not given that support? But now I've heard you say that this is an important issue. We will continue our follow-up, and if we see an increase in violence, this is not the way that Sweden should act to decrease the support. Thank you. Rejoinder, Christian Democrats.
Thank you. I'd like to underscore that it's the authority, particularly, that takes independent decisions, but also to underscore that actually the government has doubled the support of that which was earlier was provided to UNRWA, which is now given to Gaza and other areas where the activities were before. And this is hopefully also going to have an effect on to try to be a stabilizing or have a stabilizing role in the region, to also against all the settler violence and all the other violence has to be worked against, and to try to by extension have the dialogue which is now being commenced with the ceasefire. And now that we're going into phase 2, hopefully phase 3, that it's going to lead to a negotiation of a two-state solution, and that's what in the end could then create a long-term positive situation. Thank you for the floor. Thank you. That was the end of that round of rejoinders, and the next goes to Håkan Svenneling, the Left Party. You have the floor, sir.
Ja, herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, it has already been mentioned that we now have changes in support going to Palestine, which means that we are losing eyes on ground, an important observer. And what we've seen is that the churches in Jerusalem, they've asked for help, and there we sent 400 volunteers from our Christian Council. But looks like Christian Democrats who do not like this with Christians getting involved. I talked to Lars Adaktusson, your predecessor, about this, and he said back then in 2019, when it comes to that program and those travels, we have heard for many years that it is something that is not done impartially, and that created a debate, and you closed the support. And now we hear an increase in violence. We hear that the volunteers being there, it helps. Families can sleep in peace, children can go to school, and the volunteers provide a support. 2023, these volunteers made 195 visits to churches in Jerusalem, in other places. The Christian Democrats, well, you say that you want to protect Christians across the world. You've said that yourself, but what you're doing is actually the opposite, because we see an increase in violence towards Christians, Palestinians. So why close this program down? I get the feeling that you Christian Democrats would rather persecute Christians. Magnus Berntsen, Christian Democrats, please.
Herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to say that I don't agree in that description that Håkan Svenneling poses. Of course, that it's very important to us. Not just Christians should not be persecuted or should be treated in a proper manner by authorities and others. It pertains to everyone, but it's clearly the case that the Christians are the group that are most persecuted in the world, and also we talked about that accompany program also that was mentioned. I'd like to just come back. This is an authorities' decision, according to the prerequisites that the authorities have to work with, who have taken this decision. It is not a politically founded one, rather neither in the Riksdag or that this program should not be financed from Sweden. It is on the basis of the evaluations that have been made that SIDA has carried out. And we've also questions as to why this decision was taken, and I'm also expecting more answers to that. And when we want to know more about that as well. Thank you, and have answers. Thank you. Oh, so thank you, Sölling, and this party.
Mr. Speaker, you do not need to share my point of view, but the quote is actually quite true, and that is why we are asking why this program was shut down. The Christian Democrats, you've said that you want to help the Christians across the world, and at the same time, we see a deduction in support, and you do away with the Palestinian strategy. And that what we provide makes a difference. That is obvious. We have seen that in areas where Palestinians are being displaced, and we see that we have other organizations as well that now are getting reductions in aid. These organizations that de facto have contributed, we have seen them assist in processes, also in international courts about genocide. And I really wonder why the government has made this decision. Final rejoinder?
Mr. Speaker, I was not a member of the parliament when this debate from 2019 was carried out, so I don't really know how those discussions were carried out, but I still want to underscore that the authorities take their decisions on the basis of the frameworks that the Riksdag and the government have provided, and it has been a little bit disorganized. There have been a multitude of organizations that have received support, and the Riksrevision, also the state audit, has also wanted that to be followed up to see if they've had the effect that was hoped, and is part of the aid work that we've carried out, and has given the effect now that we see now with the support to the Middle East. Thank you very much. And that was the end of that rejoinder. And now it's Jakob Riesport from the Green Party. No, I'm sorry. No, first it was Jakob Riesport for the rejoinder and not for the presentation. You have the floor, sir.
Tack, herr talman, och tack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to Magnus Berntsson for the address. We have seen violence escalating in the West Bank. We see more conflict with the displacements, forced displacements, and we see what happens with settlements, military. 224 children have been killed in the West Bank the last 2 years. This is unacceptable, and we see this as part of the oppression against the Palestinians. But the Christian Democrats and the government, you've been very passive. You talk about the importance of rule of law and international law in other parts of the world, but you do not condemn what is happening here with the expansion that is illegal. You cannot just talk about a two-state solution. One has to act for that to become a reality. And my question is, or my questions rather, I know that the Christian Democrats, that you have many good friends in the Israeli government, the highest level, that you have been visiting ministers, etc. And I should say that I welcome the fact that you're being clear against the violence that we see in settlements. But isn't it time now to put pressure on the government to stop this current policy? Instead, we should have an import ban from those illegal settlements in accordance with the international decisions. I also wonder if the Christian Democrats will demand from the government that Israel dismantles these settlements and leaves all that occupied territory. Thank you, Magnus Berntsen, Christian Democrats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Member Risberg, for the questions. I'd like to start with, I think I was very clear both when about settler violence and also the expansion of these settlements, which is not acceptable. Every new such step prevents the way towards a two-state solution and continued negotiations on that. When it comes to import restrictions, it's going to be an association council that's going to, in conjunction with, within a number of weeks here is going to be in place, and where all of these questions are going to be discussed, and we'll see what that results in. But as a whole, when it comes to the settler policy, the West Bank and Gaza, then we have to find ways forward towards peaceful agreements. What I think is that such is we're going to be quite close to that. Going to be quite close to the plan that was suggested already 25 years by Clinton and Mubarak, and I can't really see anything else that could be apart from that road which we should take, which unfortunately means that we've lost 25 years when we said no to that plan at that time. And there's been so much suffering since then. But a two-state solution, according to those premises, would solve both the settler question and also the question of the violence. And I hope that's the future that we have to look forward to that we can discuss that seriously. Thank you. Thank you. Jakob Risberg, the Green Party, you have the floor.
Jag kan konstatera.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't think that answer was all that clear. You're making references to things that happened years ago, and you're not talking about the ICC requirement from this last summer about Israel dismantling all the settlements and leaving those areas. But another question. 27th of November last year, you wrote an article in a paper and commented on the arrest warrant on Netanyahu. And you say that the arrest warrant, its legitimacy is undermining the International Criminal Court. But isn't it the opposite? Even if our friends are the ones who commit war crime, they should be prosecuted. Isn't that something that increases the legitimacy of the court? I'm thinking about many countries in Africa where this would apply as well. Thank you. And final rejoinder from Magnus Berntsen.
Tack för det, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. The courts, the international courts, they should be independent and take their own decisions and judgments, and we don't question their right to make judgments. But there again, we are concerned about their legitimacy in the long run if they clearly are not as neutral, have a political agenda which cause rise for concern, and which they can compare the crimes of aggression in Ukraine, which Putin has done. We can compare that to the situation that Netanyahu was in a war of defense against the act of terror that Hamas carried out on the 7th of November. Thank you very much, and that was the end of that round of joiners. And now the presentation is now Jakob Risberg. You have the floor.
Herr talman!
Mr. Speaker, the 4th of October last year, the EU court made a decision that was hardly noticed in Swedish media. After several years of dispute, the court determined that the trade agreement that the EU had with Morocco was against international law because it regulated trade with agricultural products from occupied areas. Neither the EU nor Morocco had taken into consideration the needs of the West Saharian people. This is a decision that reminds us about colonialism and that heritage is still being around. The interests of markets control what is happening, and the interests of inhabitants are being ignored. We see conflicts across the globe about natural resources, and we see that people are deprived of control over their own assets. Swedish and European companies are often parts of this. We're trying to extract cheap raw materials in areas filled with conflict, and that adds fuel to the fire. We see the Democratic Republic Congo, where we have minerals that are being extracted, and we have an EU trade agreement with a neighboring country, Rwanda, that contributes to conflict. We also see China's occupation and how Tibetans are being displaced because they want the raw materials for batteries. Mr. Speaker, we can have a trade foreign policy that can contribute to enhancing injustices and conflicts, or we can do the opposite, work for peace, justice, sustainable developments with relatively small means. We have to take the lead. We have to ensure that international trade agreements respect international law and the local population's right to self-determination. We have to work actively so that the EU stops trade with the products from illegal Israeli settlements and occupied areas, just as the EU has stopped the trade with Russian-controlled areas of Ukraine. We also have to ensure that we have strict sustainability requirements on companies for the entire chain of production, from extraction of raw materials to the end product. The EU directive on corporate responsibility has to be implemented full out and not being watered out instead. Sweden, we have to work for a circular economy where we reduce the dependency on new raw materials. We have to focus on reuse and refurbishment. We cannot continue to exploit people and the environment. We cannot talk about sustainability internationally if we are not doing anything at home to limit our destructive impact. Our dependence on fossil fuels increases conflict and oppression. And it's time now, it's time to take responsibility for our role in the world. If we mean business with what we say about a sustainable world, we cannot allow trade to feed injustices and conflict. Mr. Speaker, our foreign policy is to build bridges. We have to create arenas for dialogue instead of being being protectionistic. We have to enhance the diplomacy, and we have to help local societies, civil society with peace processes. We have to ensure that women have a say, and we have to help in building peace. We know that the UN has shortcomings. They're aware of those, and the future pact shows that they're willing to find solutions, and we need to help out. We have to work for a rules-based world order. We have to give our support to the international courts, and we have to condemn when anyone goes against international law, be it the USA or Israel or Russia, China or Iran. Sweden has for a long time worked for international aid. We have tried to be solidaric. We have to help people who live in poverty and oppression, and we cannot be guided by short-term political winds or national self-interest. Women and girls, they carry an unproportional big burden in crisis areas. They're impacted by violence, discrimination, and they're deprived of fundamental rights, and we have to create a just world. Women, girls have to be protected against violence, but they also have to be given the resources that they need. We want to have that feminist foreign policy so that we give support to local women rights organizations, because these are the actors that knows the most about the women's position in a society. What Trump has said about about Greenland and Gaza and the future for U.S. aid, well, we see that this is self-interest. It's not international solidarity. And here we need to help out. And we want to give support to UNFPA, UNAIDS and Global Fund for securing global work for sexual and reproductive rights. We have to take that responsibility and our leadership. We cannot do what the government is doing today, just do away with the support to UNAIDS. We have to take our chance to help out. Mr. Speaker, climate change is the existential threat that we see today, and the global south are impacted the most. And we have to take our responsibility. All countries have to do that. And our part of the world, we are the biggest emitters. And at the same time, we also have the most resources and the most room for maneuver to change the transition. And we have to do that today. It can't be about those who are impacted the most that have to do this. Mr. Speaker, the full-scale invasion of Russia on Ukraine has continued for 3 years, and we see that there are ambitions from the EU to reduce the dependency on Russian fossil fuels, but nevertheless we import at record levels. 2024, we imported 17.8 million tons of Russian liquid natural gas, an increase with 2 billion tons, which means that Russia today is the second largest LNG supplier after the United States of America. We have to be humanitarians, and with a feminist foreign policy, we have Agenda 2030, we have the Paris Agreement. We have to stick to those, and we have to continue to be a driving force to reach those objectives. With our own consumption and with more stringent sustainability requirements, we can do this. We have to increase the respect for international law, we have to strengthen the international courts, and we have to increase the diplomacy, and we have to have a strong United Nations so that we can ensure that we have a rules-based world order. We cannot just expect military might to solve the conflicts in the world. Thank you, and we continue with your Forsell and that address, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When Hamas conducted its horrible terror attacks the 7th of October, they did that in part with North Korean weapons and training and intelligence from Iran. When Russia bombs Ukraine, they do it in part with drones that made in Iran with Chinese components. China's role in the war in Ukraine cannot be exaggerated. They are an enabler and are on Russia's side. The Ukrainian blood that has been spilled is dripping from both Putin's and Xi Jinping's hands. Mr. Speaker, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is an attack on all of those of us who want to live in democracies or who do. For the fact that Russia must lose the war and Ukraine must win is obvious. Russia's idea about a greater Russia, a tsardom, their revengeism and their historical revisionism must be cleared out. The ideas must capitulate, otherwise the war will come in a new time and a new form with the same ideology. Ukraine must get the weapon and ability that is required. All sanctions against Russia must be further tightened so that there's no limit. Every Russian asset, from money for property to oligarchs and their friends or families' loose property, should be seized and liquidated to finance our war against Russia. Russia must lose in all dimensions: military economical, cultural, ideological. The frozen Russian assets should be used in their entirety, both for Ukraine to be able to make war and to rebuild the state and to compensate private individuals for their losses in the war. Mr. Speaker, China uses trade to steal technology and knowledge from us. There are no private companies in China. It is not a liberal market economy where public and equal rights to ownership are guaranteed by an impartial legal system. On the contrary, China uses its legislation to steer what could have been private companies and submit them to the Chinese Communist Party. All Chinese actors are in practice outshoots of the authoritarian and anti-liberal dictator Xi Jinping, the dictator of China, and should be treated accordingly by pressuring and countries and putting them in debt. China conducts an aggressive new neocolonialism on the African continent. China is not an impressive dragon, it is a hydra with innumerable heads. They're all, each one as poisonous as the next. Mr. Speaker, in London, protests against the planned Chinese mega embassy have collected over 1,000 demonstrators, political representatives and groups from both Hong Kong, Tibet, and Chinese Democrats. The embassy will be a surveillance center and a threat to both national security and human rights in all of Europe. This is in a time, Mr. Speaker, where authoritarian forces from China, Russia, and Iran are conducting a cold war against our freedom. Great Britain and all democracies should stop such plans that can give China or Chinese actors more space. Mr. Speaker, there is a place where our democratic actions are threatened. We need to promote democracy the world over. The regime of Iran, Mr. Speaker, oppresses people in Iran and wants to spread its authoritarian Islamism to the countries around it. The regime is guilty of innumerable crimes and oppression of women. It provides Russian with weapons. It manipulates and controls its yes men in terror groups. It's the responsibility for the acts of terror on the 7th of October and the following war is also on their shoulders. The RGC is a terrorist organization, must be classified as such. Iran is a terrorist regime and must be treated like it. The Iranian influence and its proxy groups must be pushed back. They are also conducting their aggressive activities even here in Sweden. The Islamic Republicans' intelligence collection must be stopped. The illegitimate dictator must be smoked out of its holes. Mr. Speaker, Hamas started the war in the Middle East on the 7th of October. The war must be put in its historical context. The terror attacks on the 7th of October was one in a long line of pogroms against Jews going all the way back to ancient times, or at least for a couple of or several hundred years. The anti-Semitism of Hamas and its extremist Islamism have roots far older than the foundation of the modern state of Israel. Hamas has made made a long-term ceasefire impossible time and again. We want to see a two-state solution where the Palestinians can live in peace and freedom in their own country. This is not possible to achieve as long as the military capability of Hamas has not been annihilated. It's deeply unserious to talk about a two-state solution and a lasting peace without, at the same time, being able to underline this: the hostages must be released, and Hamas must capitulate without any conditions. All parties must stick to international law and minimize civilian victims as far as possible. Every civilian victim is a tragedy. Close by countries will need to take a lot of responsibility for stability and security in the area. Peace must be made permanent. Civil society civilians have suffered too much. Mr. Speaker, Taiwan is in practice a free and democratic state. It has a clearly delimited territory and a well-functioning state. it checks all the boxes to be its own independent state. This proves as well that the democratic development can go quickly, and that the future of mainland China could be a democratic one. For all other authoritarian countries or dictatorships, they could go the same route. Sweden must deepen its relationships with the country of Taiwan in all levels, economic, diplomatic, and between peoples. If we liberals could decide, we would immediately create a representation office in Taipei and a far-reaching free trade agreement. We need Taiwan, and Taiwan needs us. Mr. Speaker, when the dictatorships of the world cooperate on a deeper and deeper level, we democracies have to do the same thing, whether it's supporting Taiwan, participating in actions in the Red Sea, or working against Russia, China, and Iran, getting a greater influence. Liberal democratic world order is under threat. We have a joint responsibility to defend it. Thank you. Thank you. And the first part of the foreign policy debate is finished. The debate now moves to its second part. There will be no interpreting of the second part. Thank you.
På dessa anföranden gäller fri replikrätt. Alla ledamöter och statsråd som finns i kammaren kan begära replik om de inte hållit ett anförande eller inte ens står på talarlistan. En talare kan få ordet 2 gånger i ett replikskifte och varje replik får omfatta längst 1 minut, totalt 4 minuter alltså per duell. Anförandena hålls i talarstolen som vanligt, replikerna tas i talarstolarna framför podiet. Och ordet går nu till Alexandra Völker, Socialdemokraterna. Varsågod.
Herr talman! Det är en prövande tid. Den internationella rätten och våra gemensamt beslutade regler prövas från flera håll. Enligt Unicef lever mer än vart 6:e barn i områden påverkade av konflikt. Samtidigt blir klimatförändringarna allt mer tydliga. Med extremväder som leder till torka på ena stället och översvämningar på andra. Som orsakar svält, extrema temperaturer och lidande. Som kräver att vi agerar nu. När stater då samtidigt undergräver den internationella rätten och det multilaterala systemet är det viktigare än någonsin att Sverige står upp för det. Att Sverige kliver fram. Tyvärr är inte det vad den nuvarande regeringen gör. I själva verket är Sverige ett av de länder som minskar det ekonomiska stödet till flera FN-organisationer. Organisationer som OCHA, FNs kontor för samordning av humanitär hjälp, som verkar för att möta de enorma humanitära behoven i länder som Sudan och Demokratiska republiken Kongo. Sverige minskar kärnstödet till OCHA med 45%. Eller World Food Program som får 186 miljoner mindre i kärnstöd i år. Kärnstödet är helt nödvändigt för att FN-organisationerna ska kunna finnas på plats där behoven är som störst. För att snabbt kunna ställa om när nya kriser uppstår. Det är svårt nog att verka i humanitära kriser när stridande parter försvårar för hjälpen att komma fram. Som i Sudan, världens just nu största humanitära kris, där det utöver striderna införts restriktioner som hindrar livsavgörande humanitärt stöd att komma fram. I Etiopien, där World Food Program vittnar om hur den nuvarande situationen hotar